Have you ever felt a silence so deep it had weight to it? The kind of quiet that isn't just an absence of noise, but a presence all its own pressing in on you from all sides. It's a silence that builds in lonely places, in hearts that have sealed themselves off from the world. The world outside the small cabin was a masterpiece of harsh beauty, a kingdom of granite and pine sculpted by wind and time. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of cold stone and the promise of snow. For Mason Calloway, this was not just a landscape. It was a sanctuary. He had come to this mountain in the Sierra Nevada range 5 years ago, not to find something but to lose himself. He carried a grief so vast it felt like a second shadow, a constant companion that whispered in the rustle of leaves and sighed in the moan of the wind through the eaves of his hand-built cabin. His life was a rhythm of survival, a deliberate and unvarying ritual. Chop wood, check traps, patch the roof, clean his rifle. Each task was a stone laid upon the memory of what he'd lost. A wife whose laughter was like wind chimes. A daughter whose future had stretched no longer than 6 short years. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. A small, dust-covered rocking horse stood motionless in the corner, a monument to a life that wasn't. Mason moved through this space with a heavy grace, his face a mask carved from the same stoicism as the mountains around him. He rarely spoke, having no one to speak to, and his own voice had become a foreign sound. The solitude was a heavy blanket, and he had wrapped himself in it so tightly he could no longer remember the warmth of anything else. The leather-bound journal lay open on the rough-hewn table, a single candle casting long shadows across the page. Mason's handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the same care he once used to stitch wounds closed on bloody battlefields. November 14th, 1878. Snow came early this year. The traps yielded 2 rabbits and a fox, enough to smoke and store. The roof needs patching again on the north side. The wind finds every weakness. Dreamt of Rebecca last night. She was in our garden in Philadelphia hanging laundry. The sheets billowed like sails so white against the blue sky. Emma was running between them, playing hide and seek. I could hear her laughter but couldn't see her. Then the sheets turned red like they were soaked in blood, and I woke up. 5 years today. The pain doesn't lessen. It just changes shape. He closed the journal slowly, as if trapping something volatile within its pages. His gaze drifted to the small wooden figures lined up on the mantel above the fireplace. 12 in total. 1 carved each month since he'd arrived. Bears, wolves, foxes, eagles, guardians standing watch. The latest one, a half-finished owl, sat beside his whittling knife on the table. Mason picked up the owl, turning it in his calloused hands. His grandfather had taught him to carve when he was just a boy back in Virginia. The wood already knows what it wants to be, the old man would say. Your job is to help it remember. These figures were meant for Emma. Protection totems, his grandfather would have called them. Useless now, of course. Too late. Always too late. The irony wasn't lost on him. A doctor who couldn't save his own family. A healer with blood on his hands. Mason set the owl down and moved to the window. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue that morning, had begun to curdle. Great bruised-looking clouds gathered at the peaks, rolling down the slopes like a dark tide. He had seen it coming. The mountain had its moods, and he had learned to read them like the pages of a book. This was not a mere squall. This was a true blizzard, a white beast that would swallow the world and hold it in its jaws for days. He pulled his thick coat tighter, the worn wool smelling of wood smoke and leather, and headed out for a final check of his trap lines. The wind was a physical force now shrieking through the pines and tearing at his clothes. Snow, hard and granular, began to whip through the air, stinging his exposed cheeks. Mason moved with practiced economy, his boots crunching a steady rhythm against the rapidly whitening ground. He was not afraid. The mountain had thrown its worst at him before, and he had always endured. Endurance was his specialty. It was what had kept him sane in the chaos of field hospitals during the war, where men's screams mixed with the thunder of distant cannons, and the air was thick with the copper smell of blood and the acrid stench of gangrene. It was near the last snare, tucked under the heavy boughs of an ancient pine tree, that he saw it. Not the dark fur of a fox or the gray shadow of a rabbit, but a small mound in the snow that did not belong. It was a patch of deep, vibrant red against the stark white. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. As he drew closer, the mound shifted. A small head lifted, black hair dusted with snow, and a pair of dark, frightened eyes stared back at him. It was a child. Huddled beneath her was an even smaller form, completely shielded from the wind. Two children, Apache, by the look of their buckskin clothes and the beadwork on the older girl's worn moccasins. They were miles from the reservation lands, lost and on the verge of being consumed by the storm. For the first time in 5 years, a feeling other than the dull ache of grief pierced through Mason's armor. It was a raw, fierce, and utterly unwelcome jolt of responsibility. He looked up at the raging sky, then down at the two small faces. Leaving them was a death sentence, but bringing them into his world, into his carefully constructed silence, felt like a different kind of death entirely. The older girl's gaze held his unflinching, despite her obvious exhaustion. There was a stubborn pride in the set of her small jaw, a fierce protectiveness in the way she curled around the younger child. She was prepared to die defending her sister. Mason recognized that look. He had seen it in the eyes of wounded soldiers determined to return to battle, in mothers refusing to leave the bedsides of dying children. The strength of those with nothing left to lose. With a sigh that was lost in the howling wind, he reached down and carefully scooped up both children. The older girl stiffened but didn't struggle, her eyes never leaving his face. The younger one hung limp in his arms, her breathing shallow. It was then, as he adjusted his grip, that his hand came away wet and warm. Blood, not just cold and exhaustion, then something worse. The journey back was a battle. The older girl, who could not have been more than 8, was weak but conscious, her eyes tracking his every move with fierce, weary intelligence. The younger, perhaps 4 or 5, was a dead weight in his other arm, her small body limp with cold and exhaustion. He wrapped them both as best he could in his own coat, shielding them with his body against the gale. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, trying to rip them from his grasp. But Mason bent his head and pushed forward his own warmth, a desperate offering against the mountain's fury. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a haven of gold and shadow. He kicked the door shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the gentle hiss and pop of the fire. He laid the children down on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth, his movements swift and sure. He stripped off their wet outer clothes and wrapped them in his driest wool blankets. The younger one moaned softly but didn't wake. The older girl sat up, pulling the blanket tight around her sister, her gaze never leaving Mason. It was not a look of gratitude. It was a look of challenge, of pure, undiluted suspicion. She was a small, cornered animal, ready to fight for the only thing she had left. As he moved to examine the younger child, the older girl growled something in Apache, her small hands shooting out to grip his wrist with surprising strength. Her meaning was clear enough without translation. "Don't touch her." Mason paused, meeting her gaze steadily. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed to the dark stains spreading on the blanket where the younger girl's shoulder pressed against it. "She's hurt," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Bleeding. Do you understand? I need to see." The girl's expression didn't change, but her grip on his wrist loosened slightly. Taking this as permission, Mason carefully pulled back the blanket. The wound was on the little one's upper arm, an angry furrow carved into the flesh. Not deep, thankfully, but the edges were raw and inflamed. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who had spent 4 years pulling bullets from soldiers. A gunshot wound, clean through, at least the bullet passing through muscle without hitting bone. Mason looked up sharply at the older girl. "Who shot her?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. The girl stared back, silent and wary. Whatever had happened, she wasn't sharing it with a stranger. Mason exhaled slowly, forcing down the sudden anger that had flared in his chest. Children. Someone had shot at children. He didn't need the details to know this wasn't right. "I need to clean the wound," he said, making his voice gentler. "To help her. Do you understand?" No response, just those watchful, wary eyes. Mason sighed and went to the wooden chest in the corner, the one he hadn't opened in 5 years. The one that still held the tools of his former life. The brass clasps were stiff with disuse, but they yielded under his fingers. Inside, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, was his medical kit. The sight of it sent a pang through his chest, a physical ache of remembrance. How many times had Rebecca prepared this kit for him, carefully replenishing the supplies before he went out to tend to a neighbor's illness or injury? He pushed the memory aside and carried the kit back to the hearth. The older girl watched his every move, her body tense, ready to intervene if he did anything threatening. Mason worked methodically, first stoking the fire to bring more light and warmth, then setting water to boil. While he waited for the water, he examined the younger girl more thoroughly. Besides the gunshot wound, she was suffering from exposure and exhaustion, but her pulse was steady. The older girl had fared better, though he noted dark circles under her eyes and the gaunt hollows of her cheeks. They had been traveling hard and probably without adequate food. "What's your name?" he asked the older girl, not really expecting an answer. She remained silent, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Mason," he tried again, touching his chest. "Mason Calloway." Still nothing. When the water was hot, he cleaned the wound as gently as he could, using skills that had once been as natural as breathing, but now felt rusty and uncertain. The little girl whimpered in her sleep but didn't wake. That concerned him. She should have responded more to the pain. He applied a poultice of yarrow and comfrey plants he had gathered and dried over the summer, more out of habit than any expectation of needing them. As he worked, he felt the weight of the older girl's scrutiny. She watched his hands with a focus that suggested she was memorizing every movement, every technique. When he was done, he bandaged the wound with clean strips of linen and sat back on his heels. "She needs to stay warm," he told the older girl, "and she needs to drink when she wakes. Water first, then broth, if she can manage it." For the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than suspicion in the girl's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, a grudging acknowledgement that he had helped rather than harmed. Mason ladled warm broth from the pot simmering over the fire into 2 wooden bowls. He set one down near the older girl, a silent offering. She stared at it, then at him, her small chin set in a stubborn line. He did not press, turning instead to the younger girl. He dipped a corner of a clean cloth in the warm liquid and gently moistened her lips. He worked with a deep, instinctual tenderness he thought had been buried long ago, a muscle memory from a different life. The tenderness brought pain with it, a shadow of Emma lying ill, her small face flushed with fever as he desperately tried every remedy he knew. The memory was like a knife between his ribs. The cabin was filled with a new kind of tension. It was the silence of 3 heartbeats instead of one, the air thick with fear, suspicion, and the ghosts that stirred in the firelight. Mason settled into his worn wooden chair, watching as the older girl finally gave in to hunger and began to sip cautiously at the broth. "You're safe here," he said quietly, not sure if she understood English or not. "For now, at least, until the storm passes." The girl didn't respond, but her shoulders lowered fractionally. Not trust, not even close, but perhaps the first small step toward it. That night, Mason did not sleep. He sat in his chair, the rifle across his lap, and watched the fire dance. Outside, the blizzard raged, a tempest of white noise and raw power. Inside, a different storm was brewing. The sisters slept on the rug, the older one's arm thrown protectively over the younger, even in sleep. Their soft, rhythmic breathing was a sound the cabin had not known for half a decade. It was a sound that dismantled him brick by silent brick. Each gentle exhale seemed to find the cracks in the fortress of his grief, whispering of small chests rising and falling in a cradle that now stood empty. He looked at them, their dark hair fanned out against the bare skin, and he saw not 2 strangers, but the specters of his own loss. He saw the curve of Rebecca's cheek in the older girl's sleeping face. He saw the trusting smallness of Emma in the younger one's curled form. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. He had invited life back into this tomb, and it was excruciating. When he opened his eyes, the older girl was awake. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. Her dark eyes were wide with a different, more complex emotion. She had seen the flicker of agony on his face, the raw pain he kept so carefully hidden. She saw his ghosts. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the firelit space, a silent, mutual acknowledgement of a sorrow that needed no words. The barrier between them, the wall of fear and distrust, had not vanished, but a small, crucial stone had been dislodged. He was no longer just a strange, silent man. She was no longer just a lost child. They were 2 souls adrift in the same storm, recognizing the darkness in each other's eyes. The next morning, Mason woke with a start, still in his chair. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. The fire had burned low and the cabin was cold. The storm still raged outside the wind, finding every crack and crevice in the walls. He stoked the fire quickly, adding fresh logs until it blazed anew. The younger girl was still asleep, her breathing more regular, now some color returned to her cheeks. The older one sat beside her alert and watchful. Mason checked the bandage. The wound showed no signs of infection, a small mercy. "She's doing better," he said, meeting the older girl's gaze. "But she needs to drink and eat." To his surprise, the girl nodded slightly, the first acknowledgement that she understood his words. Progress of a sort. He prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of his honey. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the girl's gaze following him around the small space. She cataloged everything: the layout of the cabin, the location of tools and weapons, the exits and entrances. A survivor's assessment. When the food was ready, he set a bowl down beside her. This time she took it without hesitation, though she waited until he had moved away before taking a bite. Her hunger overrode her caution as she ate quickly, her eyes darting between him and her sister. After she finished, she surprised him by pointing to her sister, then to the bowl, then making a drinking motion. She wanted him to help feed the younger girl. Mason nodded and knelt beside the small, sleeping form. With the older girl's assistance, they managed to rouse the younger one enough to take a few spoonfuls of the warm mush and several sips of water. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, deep brown, unfocused with fever and pain, before closing again. Throughout the day, the storm held them captive. The world outside the single window was a churning vortex of white. Inside, the rhythm of their strange temporary life began to settle. Mason tended to the wounded child, changed her bandages, and prepared simple, nourishing food. The older girl maintained her vigilant watch, but the edge of her wariness seemed to dull slightly with each passing hour. In the gray light of afternoon, Mason took a small block of pine and his whittling knife. He sat by the fire, the children watching him. His large, calloused hands, so used to the brutal work of an am or the cold steel of a rifle, moved with surprising delicacy. Shavings fell away like snowflakes, and slowly a shape began to emerge. A bird, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening for a song. He worked without looking up, pouring his concentration into the simple task, the repetitive motion a balm for his turbulent thoughts. The older girl edged closer, curiosity temporarily outweighing caution. She watched his hands transform the raw wood into something alive and graceful. When it was finished, smooth and perfect in its simplicity, he held it out to her. He said nothing. She hesitated, then took it, her small fingers careful against his rough palm. She turned the little bird over and over, her fingers tracing its wooden form. For a moment, the hardness in her eyes softened, and she looked like what she was: a child, not a warrior. Kiona. The word was so unexpected, so soft, that for a moment Mason wasn't sure he'd heard it. The girl touched her chest. Kiona. Then she pointed to her sleeping sister. Ayana. Names. She had given him their names, a small but significant token of trust. Mason nodded solemnly, acknowledging the gift. Kiona, he repeated, pointing to her. Ayana. His finger moved to the sleeping child. He touched his own chest. Mason. Kiona nodded once, a formal acceptance of this exchange. Then she moved back to her sister's side, the wooden bird still clutched in her hand. It was a beginning. So, that evening, as Mason prepared a stew from dried meat and the root vegetables he had stored for winter, Ayana woke properly for the first time. Her small whimper of pain drew Kiona to her side instantly. The two sisters spoke rapidly in Apache, Kiona's tone soothing and reassuring. Mason approached slowly, carrying a cup of willow bark tea he had prepared for the pain. He knelt at a respectful distance, offering the cup to Kiona. For the pain, he said, miming drinking, and then pointing to Ayana's shoulder. Kiona took the cup and sniffed it suspiciously. She seemed to recognize the bitter scent of willow bark because she nodded and helped Ayana sit up enough to sip this tea. The younger girl's eyes, clearer now, but still heavy with exhaustion, fixed on Mason. There was no fear in them, only a solemn, assessing curiosity. Hello, Ayana, Mason said softly. You're safe. To his surprise, Ayana's lips curved in a small, tentative smile. Safe, she repeated, her accent thick, but the word clear enough. Mason felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement of emotions long buried. That simple word, that small smile, they breached defenses he had thought impenetrable. Kiona said something sharp in Apache, and Ayana's smile faded. The older girl's expression had hardened again, the brief softening gone. She was reminding her sister of something, a warning perhaps? A rule about strangers, about white men. Mason didn't push. He returned to the stew, giving them space. As he stirred the pot, he heard them whispering again, their voices rising and falling like the wind outside. He caught his name once spoken in Ayana's higher pitch, followed by a quick hushing sound from Kiona. They ate together, huddled by the fire. The silence remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of solitude. It was a shared quiet, a space of communion filled not with words but with the clinking of spoons against wooden bowls, the crackle of the fire, and the silent growing understanding between three people shipwrecked together in the heart of winter. After dinner, Ayana's eyes began to droop again. The willow bark tea and food had eased her pain, and her body demanded rest to heal. Kiona helped her lie down on the bearskin, tucking the blanket around her with a tenderness that made Mason's throat tighten. As Ayana drifted off to sleep, her small hand clutching her sister's, Kiona looked up at Mason. "Thank you," she said, the words careful and clearly rehearsed. "For help, Ayana." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. How long had it been since anyone had thanked him? Since anyone had spoken to him at all? Kiona's gaze traveled around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the shelf of books, the wooden figures on the mantel. Her eyes lingered on the dust-covered rocking horse in the corner. "You have child?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit him like a blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The carefully compartmentalized grief threatened to rupture its boundaries and flood through him. Had he finally managed? "I had a child." Kiona's eyes, wise beyond their years, held his. "No more," Mason shook his head. "No more. She died with her mother's sickness." The words were stones dragged up from the depths. Kiona digested this information, her expression solemn. "I'm sorry," she said after a long moment. It wasn't just politeness. There was a depth of understanding in those two simple words that went beyond her years. Mason turned away, unable to bear the weight of her sympathy winding. He busied himself with cleaning up from dinner, his movements mechanical. When he turned back, Kiona had curled up beside Ayana and appeared to be asleep. He knew she wasn't, though. Beneath those lowered lids, she was still watching, still assessing. Trust came hard in a world that had taught her its dangers. As the second night fell, a new sound threaded its way through the howl of the wind. It started as a low, mournful cry far in the distance, but it grew steadily closer, multiplying. A wolf pack. They were hungry, emboldened by the storm, and they had caught the scent of the cabin, the scent of fire, of food of life. The howls rose in a chorus, a primal song of hunger and the wild. Ayana, startled from her sleep, began to cry, burying her face in her sister's side. Kiona held her tight, her own body trembling, but her eyes were fixed on Mason. He rose slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, and took his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He checked the load, the metallic click echoing loudly in the tense room. He didn't look at the children. He walked to the heavy plank door and stood before it, a silent sentinel. He was a mountain of a man silhouetted against the flickering firelight, the long rifle held loosely in his hands. In that moment, he was no longer just a man grieving in a cabin. He was a protector, a guardian. The howls grew more frantic, circling the small structure, the sounds of claws scrabbling at the logs. Mason remained perfectly still, a bulwark of quiet strength between the children and the snarling dark. He was defending more than just their lives. He was defending the fragile warmth that had begun to seep into the frozen corners of his own heart. Kiona, watching him, seemed to understand. She gently shushed her sister, her own fear momentarily forgotten. She slid from the bearskin rug and moved to stand a few feet behind Mason, a small dark shadow mimicking his resolute posture. They stood together, the large man and the small girl, a silent, unspoken alliance waiting for the dawn. Hours passed. The wolves' howls eventually receded as they sought easier prey. Mason remained at his post until the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window. Only then did he lower the rifle and turn to find Kiona still standing behind him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but determined to stay awake as long as he did. "They're gone," he said softly. "You should sleep now." Kiona shook her head. "Ayana need medicine. Fever come back." Mason checked the younger girl and found her hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. The wound, when he examined it, showed the first signs of infection, red, swollen with thin lines of inflammation spreading outward. His heart sank. Without proper medicines, without better conditions than this remote cabin could provide. No, he wouldn't think that way. He had seen men survive worse on battlefields with less care than he could offer here. I'll make more tea, he said, already moving to the shelves where he kept his dried herbs, and a poultice for the wound. As he worked, Kiona hovered nearby, watching each step with intense focus. When he crushed the dried yarrow and mixed it with comfrey and a pinch of powdered charcoal, her eyes widened with recognition. "You know this medicine," she said, not a question but a statement. Mason nodded. "I was a doctor before." "Doctor," Kiona repeated the word, clearly familiar. "Healer." "Yes, healer." The word felt both true and false in his mouth. What kind of healer failed to save his own family? Kiona's next words caught him off guard. "My mother is healer, powerful healer." There was pride in her voice, but also something else. Worry, fear. "Is she looking for you?" Mason asked, carefully applying the fresh poultice to Ayana's wound. Kiona's expression closed off immediately. "Men looking for us. Bad men." She made a gesture like a gun firing. "Shoot Ayana." Mason's hand stilled. "Who shot her, Kiona? Who are you running from?" But Kiona had said all she intended to. She turned away, her small shoulders rigid with renewed tension. The fragile bridge of trust between them stretched thin, but didn't break. Throughout the day, they tended to Ayana together. The fever rose and fell, a tide of sickness that left the small girl weak and disoriented. When she was awake, Mason tried to get her to drink as much as possible water, willow bark tea, thin broth. Kiona never left her sister's side, speaking to her softly in Apache, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, singing what sounded like lullabies when the pain made Ayana cry. Mason found himself watching them with a complex mixture of emotions. Grief, yes, always grief, but also a reluctant admiration for Kiona's unwavering dedication to her sister. She was so young to bear such responsibility, yet she did it without complaint. By evening, Ayana's fever had broken, and she slept peacefully. Kiona, exhausted from her vigil, had finally succumbed to sleep as well, curled protectively around her sister. Mason covered them both with an extra blanket and moved to his chair by the fire. The storm outside had begun to abate, the howling wind dying down to occasional gusts. Tomorrow, perhaps, it would be clear enough for the children to continue their journey, to wherever they were going, away from whatever danger pursued them. The thought brought an unexpected pang. Mason had grown accustomed to his solitude, had embraced it as the only tolerable state after his loss. But these past 2 days had awakened something he thought long dead, a sense of purpose, of connection, however tenuous and temporary. When they left, the silence would return. But it would be different now, heavier, more noticeable. Mason's gaze fell on the small wooden rocking horse in the corner. In the firelight, the dust that covered it seemed to shimmer like frost. Emma's birthday gift, carved with his own hands during the long winter evenings while she slept. She had ridden it exactly 7 times before the fever took her. Without conscious thought, Mason found himself crossing the room. His hand hovered over the small saddle, hesitant, as if the wood might burn him. 5 years he had kept this talisman of his grief, this monument to his loss. 5 years he had let the dust gather untouched, undisturbed. His fingers finally made contact, brushing away a small patch of dust. The wood beneath was still smooth, still polished from his careful sanding, still waiting for a child who would never return. Mason closed his eyes, a tide of memory washing through him. Emma's delighted laughter when she first saw the horse. Rebecca's proud smile as she watched their daughter rock back and forth, imagining great adventures. The 3 of them, a family whole and complete. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself tears. They felt foreign, these drops of salt water that carved warm paths down his weathered cheeks. Foreign, but somehow necessary, like the breaking of ice in spring. He wiped them away roughly and returned to his chair. Sleep was a distant possibility, crowded out by memories and the unfamiliar stirring of emotions long dormant. Instead, he picked up his whittling knife and a fresh piece of pine. As the night deepened around the cabin, as the storm whispered its final threats before moving on, Mason's knife moved with steady purpose. Beneath his hands, the wood surrendered its secrets, revealing the form that had been waiting inside all along, a small, graceful horse mane, flowing legs poised in mid-gallop. A gift, though he did not yet acknowledge it as such. A gesture reaching across a void he had thought uncrossable. A beginning. The dawn came as a whisper, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of lavender and rose. The storm had finally broken, its fury spent. The world outside was reborn, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The silence that returned was profound, a sacred hush over the transformed landscape. Mason stood at the window, his breath misting the cold glass. The small wooden horse, completed in the night hours, sat on the table behind him. In the clear morning light, he could see how the situation stood. The snow was deep, too deep for safe travel, especially for two young children, one of them injured. They would need to stay at least another day, perhaps two, until the sun had a chance to melt the worst of it and make the paths navigable again. He wasn't sure how he felt about this forced extension of their stay, relief, dread. Both seemed to war within him, along with a growing concern about whoever had shot at these children and might still be looking for them. A small sound behind him made him turn. Ayana was awake, sitting up on the bearskin, watching him with those solemn eyes. Kiona still slept beside her, exhaustion finally claiming its due. "Good morning," Mason said quietly, moving back to the hearth to stoke the fire. "How do you feel?" Ayana considered this question carefully, her small face serious. "Better," she decided, her voice a soft musical thing. "No more fire in arm." "Good, that's good." Mason checked her forehead, cool to the touch. The fever was gone. "Are you hungry?" Ayana nodded eagerly, and Mason set about preparing a simple breakfast. As he worked, he felt the weight of the child's gaze. Unlike Kiona's watchful suspicion, Ayana's regard was openly curious, almost friendly. "You save us," she said suddenly. "From snow, from wolves." Hudson paused in his stirring. "Yes," he acknowledged, "but your sister saved you first. She kept you warm, kept you safe until I found you." Ayana nodded solemnly. "Kiona always saved me, since Mama go away." Mason turned fully to face her. "Where did your mama go, Ayana?" The little girl's expression clouded. "Bad men want Mama, because she's special. She heal people, make magic with plants." Ayana lowered her voice to a whisper. "Some people afraid. Say she witch." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter morning. Witch accusations. Even in these supposedly enlightened times, such things could be a death sentence, especially for a native woman. "So your mama sent you away to keep you safe?" he asked gently. Ayana nodded. "We go to grandmother, in mountains, but bad men find us, shoot guns." Her small hand went to her wounded shoulder, and her eyes filled with tears. "Kiona carry me in snow, long time. Then you find." Mason's heart clenched at the simple story. Two little girls alone in a blizzard, running from men with guns. The world could be so brutally unkind. "You're safe now," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "And when the snow melts a bit, I'll help you find your grandmother." Ayana's face brightened. "You help us," before Mason could answer, a sharp voice cut in. Kiona was awake, and from her tone, she was not pleased with this conversation. She rattled off a string of Apache to Ayana, who responded with a defiant lift of her chin. Mason returned to the breakfast preparation, giving them space for their disagreement. He could guess the content well enough. Kiona wary and protective, warning Ayana against trusting a stranger too readily. Ayana younger and more innocent, seeing only the kindness he had shown. When he turned back with 2 bowls of hot porridge, Kiona was sitting up, her expression guarded once more. "Storm gone," she said, taking the bowl. "We go today." Mason shook his head. "Snow too deep. Dangerous for Ayana. Wait 1 day, maybe 2. Kiona's jaw set in a stubborn line, but she didn't argue. The logic was sound, and her sister's safety came first. She ate quickly, her eyes darting occasionally to the window, as if expecting to see pursuers materializing from the trees. After breakfast, Mason checked Ayana's wound. The infection had retreated, the angry red lines fading. His poultice had done its work. With proper care, she would heal completely, with only a small scar to mark the experience. "You good doctor," Kiona said, watching him change the bandage. Mason felt a twinge of an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. "Pride, regret, I was," he said quietly. "Once. Why stop?" Kiona asked, direct as always. Mason hesitated. How to explain the depth of his failure, the weight of his guilt to a child? "I couldn't save the people I loved most," he said finally. "My wife, my daughter. So I stopped trying to save anyone." Kiona absorbed this with a gravity beyond her years. "But you save Ayana," she pointed out. "You still heal her." inside. She touched her chest over her heart. Mason had no answer for that. The simple truth of her words left him speechless. The day passed quietly. Ayana, though improved, was still weak from her ordeal and slept for much of it. Kiona, somewhat relaxed by the knowledge that they couldn't leave yet anyway, allowed herself to explore the cabin more openly. She examined the books on the shelf, running her fingers along their spines. She studied the wooden figures on the mantel, careful not to touch. Mason found the small wooden horse he had carved during the night and offered it to her. "For Ayana," he said, "when she's stronger." Kiona took it, her expression softening as she studied the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said, the most complex English sentence he had heard from her. "She will love." The simple exchange felt momentous, somehow a shift in the atmosphere between them. Not quite trust, but something approaching it. In the afternoon, Mason brought out his medical kit again and laid out the contents for Kiona to see. "I can teach you," he said, "some simple things. For Ayana's wound, for when you continue your journey." He couldn't bring himself to say leave. Kiona's eyes widened, then narrowed with sudden suspicion. "Why?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "Because you may need it, and because—" He stopped, surprised by the truth that rose unbidden to his lips. "Because I think you have a healer's hands, like your mother." Kiona stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to detect a lie or a trick. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Teach me." For the next few hours, as the winter sun traced its low arc across the sky, Mason shared what he could of his knowledge. How to check for fever. How to clean a wound properly. Which herbs helped with pain, which with infection. Kiona absorbed it all with an intensity that reminded him of the most dedicated medical students he had known. She was a quick study, her small hands deft and gentle, as she practiced bandaging Mason's arm. Her questions were insightful, cutting to the heart of each technique. By the time Ayana woke again, Kiona had mastered the basics of wound care and was proudly showing her sister what she had learned. Ayana, for her part, was delighted with the wooden horse. She held it carefully as if it might break and made it gallop across the bearskin rug with soft sound effects. The simple joy in her face sent another pang through Mason's heart, a bittersweet mixture of remembered happiness and present loss. As evening approached, Mason prepared a heartier meal than they had yet shared: venison stew with the last of his preserved vegetables. The rich aroma filled the cabin, and even Kiona's stoic demeanor softened at the prospect of a proper meal. They ate together by the fire, the atmosphere more relaxed than it had been. Ayana chattered about the wooden horse, naming it Sukala, which she explained meant fast runner in Apache. Kiona, while still watchful, allowed herself to smile at her sister's enthusiasm. It was almost like having a family again. The thought came unbidden to Mason, bringing with it a wave of guilt so strong it nearly took his breath away. He had no right to such thoughts. No right to imagine these children as anything other than temporary visitors, strangers thrust upon him by circumstance. No right to want them to stay. As if sensing his sudden withdrawal, Kiona glanced at him sharply. Something in his expression must have revealed his inner turmoil, because her own face softened fractionally. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for food, for medicine, for—" She gestured around the cabin, encompassing all of it. "For safety." Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The lump in his throat felt like a stone. Later, as the children prepared for sleep, Mason took his journal from the table. For the first time in years, he felt the need to capture more than just the bare facts of survival. He needed to give shape to the emotions churning within him, to pin them to the page before they overwhelmed him. November 17th, 1878. The storm has passed. The children will leave soon. Kiona and Ayana, Apache sisters, running from men with guns, running to their grandmother in the mountains. Their mother is a healer, accused of witchcraft perhaps. Always the same story: fear turning to hatred, hatred to violence. Ayana was shot. The bullet passed clean through her shoulder. I treated the wound. It became infected, but the fever broke today. She will recover fully, I think. She's so small, so trusting, despite what she's been through. She reminds me of—" He stopped writing, the pen hovering above the page. To acknowledge the similarity, to write it down, felt dangerous. As if naming it might make the pain fresher, the loss more acute. Kiona is different, older in spirit than in years, wary, protective, carrying too much weight for such small shoulders. She reminds me of the soldiers I treated during the war, the ones who had seen too much, who carried the burden of survival when others did not. I taught her some basic medicine today. She learned quickly. She has a healer's hands, as I told her. Like her mother, perhaps. Like I once did before I buried that part of myself along with Rebecca and Emma. When they leave, the silence will return. It should be a relief, a return to the peace I sought when I came to this mountain. Instead, I find myself dreading it. What does that mean? Mason closed the journal slowly. He knew what it meant. The hermitage he had built for himself, the fortress of solitude he had thought impenetrable, had been breached. Not by force, but by something far more powerful, the simple presence of two children who needed him. Not just for food and shelter, not just for medical care, but for protection, for safety in a world that had proven itself dangerous, for the warmth of human connection in the cold wilderness. The thought terrified him. To care was to risk loss. He knew that lesson all too well. But as he looked at the sleeping forms of Kiona and Ayana, their breathing synchronized in the firelit darkness, Mason faced a truth he had been running from for 5 long years. The loss had already happened. It could not be undone, could not be averted by isolation or silence, or the careful construction of a life without attachments. Rebecca and Emma were gone. No amount of self-imposed exile would bring them back or honor their memory. Perhaps, and the thought came like a shaft of light through clouds, perhaps the true betrayal was not in allowing new connections, but in refusing them, in denying the capacity for care that Rebecca had loved in him, that Emma had depended upon. Mason stood and moved to the window. Outside, the night was clear, the stars brilliant in the black sky. The snow reflected their light, creating a landscape of silver and shadow. Beautiful and cold and profoundly alone. He did not want to be alone anymore. The realization shook him to his core, challenging the foundations of the life he had built since the day he buried his family. It wasn't a replacement he sought. Nothing could replace what he had lost. But perhaps there was room in his wounded heart for something new. Something different, but no less real. Mason turned back to the sleeping children, his decision made. Tomorrow, if the snow had melted enough to make travel possible, he would not simply send them on their way. He would go with them, guide them to their grandmother, ensure their safety. He was no longer a doctor. That path was closed to him, but he could still be a protector. For a little while at least. It wasn't redemption he sought. Some failures could never be redeemed. But it was a purpose, a reason to step outside the fortress of grief he had built around himself. It was perhaps a beginning. The third day dawned clear and cold. The sun, a pale gold disk in the eastern sky, began its work on the blanket of snow, turning the surface into a glittering field of diamonds. Mason rose early, restless with the decision he had made in the night. He stoked the fire and began preparations for the day, his movements filled with a new energy. As he worked, he sensed rather than heard Kiona waking. She watched him for several minutes before speaking. "We go today." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "If you want to. The snow will still be deep, but navigable." He hesitated, then added, "I can guide you to your grandmother's." Kiona's expression betrayed nothing, but her gaze sharpened. Why? The question was valid. Why would a recluse who had built a life away from people suddenly offer to leave his sanctuary? Mason searched for an answer that would make sense to her, that would not reveal too much of his own inner turmoil. "Because it's dangerous," he said finally. "The men who shot Ayana might still be looking for you, and because—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Because I think I need to." Kiona studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. "Need to what?" "Leave here for a while." Mason gestured around the cabin. "This place? It's become a tomb. I've been hiding here, from life, from people." From pain, he didn't say, but Kiona's perceptive eyes suggested she heard it anyway. She nodded slowly. "You help us find grandmother, then what?" Mason shrugged. "Then I come back, or, I don't know." The future beyond the immediate task felt hazy, undefined. One step at a time. This pragmatic approach seemed to satisfy Kiona. She nodded again more decisively. "We go when sun high, warmer then." As they prepared for the journey, Mason felt a curious mixture of trepidation and anticipation. He packed food, medical supplies, extra blankets. He cleaned and checked his rifle. He hesitated over his journal, then tucked it into his pack as well. This was an ending of sorts, but also a beginning. It deserved to be documented. Ayanna, when she woke, was excited about the prospect of traveling with Mason. She showed none of her sister's caution, chattering happily about introducing him to their grandmother, about showing him the special plants her mother used for healing, about the horses their family kept before they had to flee. Her innocent enthusiasm was a balm and a wound at once. Mason found himself smiling at her descriptions, even as each one reminded him of Emma's similar excitement about the simplest things. By midday, they were ready. Mason took a final look around the cabin, the home he had built with his own hands, the refuge that had become a prison. Would he return? He wasn't sure. The future was as vast and uncharted as the wilderness outside. He closed the door behind them but did not lock it. Whatever happened, he would not be the same man if he returned. The door would remain unlocked, a symbol of the change that had already begun within him. The sun was at its zenith, warming the snow just enough to make travel possible. Mason led the way, breaking a path through the deeper drifts, Kiona following with Ayanna riding piggyback. The little girl still held the wooden horse, unwilling to leave her new treasure behind. They had gone perhaps half a mile from the cabin when Mason felt it a prickling at the back of his neck, an instinctual awareness of being watched. He stopped scanning the tree line, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. Kiona sensed his tension immediately. "What wrong?" she whispered, her body tensing, ready to run or fight. "Not sure," Mason murmured. "Just a feeling." Then he saw her, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree line almost 100 yards away. A woman tall and slender, wrapped in a deerskin cloak. Even at this distance, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. She held a long bow in one hand, an arrow nocked. She had been watching the cabin, waiting. "Ina!" Ayanna's cry shattered the stillness. "Ina!" Kiona's breath caught in a single sharp intake. "Mother," she whispered the word of prayer. The tension in the clearing, which had just begun to recede, snapped back to sharp and cold as an icicle. The woman at the edge of the trees straightened her posture, alert, wary. She had seen the children emerge from the cabin with a strange man, and she was clearly assessing the situation, determining if her daughters were in danger. Mason felt a complex wave of emotions: relief for the children, regret for the loss of his temporary purpose, and a primal, inexplicable fear of the woman who stood like a judgment at the edge of his world. She represented the world he had fled, the connections he had severed. She was here to reclaim her daughters, and in doing so to reclaim the silence he had so briefly lost. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung his rifle and laid it in the snow. Then he stepped back, hands held open and empty at his sides, a gesture of peace. The woman Ina, as Ayanna had called her, began to walk toward them. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her feet making no sound on the deep snow. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, grief, and fierce resolve. Her eyes, dark and piercing, never left his. They were the same eyes as her daughters, carrying the same wary intelligence, but honed by years of hardship and something else, a depth of knowing that went beyond ordinary perception. As she drew closer, the cabin door flew open and the two girls rushed past Mason, their small legs churning through the snow. "Ina!" The cry echoed in the vast stillness. The reunion was not loud or effusive. It was a desperate, silent clinging. Ananayeli Mason remembered Kiona saying her mother's name, gathered her daughters into her arms, burying her face in their hair, her body shaking with a relief so profound it was almost violent. Kiona, her face pressed against her mother's shoulder, turned her head slightly. Her gaze met Mason's over her mother's back. It was a look that held 1,000 unspoken words: gratitude, fear, apology, and a deep child's understanding of the man's hidden sorrow. Nayeli eventually rose, her daughters clinging to her legs. Her eyes swept over Mason, then to the cabin door, then back to her children. She saw their dry clothes, the bandage on Ayanna's shoulder, the wooden horse clutched in the younger girl's hand. She was reading the entire story of the past 3 days in those silent details. There was no accusation in her gaze, only a deep, penetrating assessment. She saw everything. Mason stood still under her scrutiny, feeling oddly exposed, as if this woman could see not just his actions, but his thoughts, his dreams, the very core of his being. It was unnerving and strangely liberating at once. Nayeli spoke at last, her voice low and musical, with only a slight accent. "You saved my daughters." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded anyway. They were lost in the storm. Ayanna was shot. He hesitated, then added, "I was a doctor. Before." Something flickered in Nayeli's eyes, recognition perhaps, or confirmation of something she had already sensed. A healer, she said, like me. The parallel sent a strange shiver through Mason. Not anymore, he said quietly. Nayeli's gaze intensified as if she could see the scars on his soul. Once a healer, always a healer, she said. Even when the hands stop, the heart remembers. The simple wisdom of her words struck Mason silent. She had articulated in a single sentence what he had been struggling to understand for days. Why are men hunting you? He asked after a moment. Ayanna said they shot at you because you're a healer, because some think you're a witch. The last word was difficult to say, laden as it was with centuries of fear and superstition. Nayeli's expression hardened. Not just because I heal, because of what I see. She tapped her temple. Visions, the future sometimes, the past, the dead. Her gaze seemed to look through him rather than at him. Your wife, your daughter, they walk with you still. Mason felt the blood drain from his face. How could she know he had told Kiona about his family? Yes, but not their nature, not the specifics. And yet this woman spoke as if she could see Rebecca and Emma standing beside him. Who's hunting you? He asked again, his voice hoarse. A man named Walter Blackwood, Nayeli said, her voice flat with hatred. A bounty hunter. He claims I killed his brother with witchcraft, but his brother died because he tried to. She glanced at her daughters and left the sentence unfinished. I defended myself, used knowledge of plants that are not meant to harm but can. Now he hunts us. He has papers, a reward. $500 for the witch who murdered his brother. The story clicked into place with terrible clarity. A woman defending herself against assault using the only weapons available to her. A vengeful relative with the law on his side, or at least the appearance of it, and two innocent children caught in the middle. Where will you go? Mason asked. My mother's people, Nayeli said, in the high mountains to the east. They will shelter us until it is safe to return or until we can travel further north. Mason nodded. It was a sound plan. The mountain tribes were often more isolated, less accessible to white bounty hunters or lawmen. I was going to guide your daughters there, he said. I still can. All of you. Nayeli studied him, her expression unreadable. Why would you do this? Mason struggled to articulate the complex tangle of motivations that had led him to this moment. Because it's right, he said finally. Because they're children. Because he trailed off, unable to voice the deeper truth that in helping them, he had found a purpose again, a reason to step outside the prison of his grief. Nayeli nodded slowly as if she had heard the unspoken words anyway. We leave now, she said. Blackwood is close. 2 days behind, perhaps less. Mason felt a surge of alarm. How do you know? Nayeli tapped her temple again. I see, and I listen. The birds, the wind, they speak if you know how to hear. She turned to her daughters, speaking rapidly in Apache. Kiona nodded and began to check Ayanna's bandage, explaining something to her mother in their native tongue. Mason watched the family reunion with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief that the children were safe, that their mother had found them. Sadness that his brief time as their protector was ending. And something else, a sense of purpose taking shape, a path forward that had been obscured by grief for too long. I'll get my things, he said, turning back toward the cabin. We can travel east together, at least until you're safely beyond Blackwood's reach. As he walked away, he heard Nayeli say something to her daughters. Ayanna's clear, high voice responded with his name. Mason. He paused, glancing back. The three of them were watching him. Nayeli with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through flesh to spirit, Kiona with solemn assessment, and Ayanna with open affection. In that moment, something shifted within him. The fortress of his grief didn't crumble. It would never be that simple, but a door appeared in its walls. A door he had created himself unknowingly when he chose to help two lost children in a snowstorm. A door leading not back to the past, but forward into an uncertain future. A beginning. The mountain path narrowed as they climbed higher, the air growing thinner with each step. Mason led the way, his rifle slung across his back, his pack heavy with supplies from the cabin. Behind him came Nayeli, moving with fluid grace despite the difficult terrain, Ayanna perched on her hip. Kiona brought up the rear, her watchful eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They had been traveling for hours, putting distance between themselves and the cabin, between themselves and the man called Blackwood, who hunted them. The sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered slopes. Soon they would need to find shelter for the night. Mason felt the unfamiliar weight of responsibility with each step. It had been 5 years since he had concerned himself with the welfare of others. 5 years of solitude, of speaking to no one but himself and the ghosts of his past. Now suddenly he was responsible for guiding 3 people through treacherous terrain, away from danger. The strangeness of it pressed upon him like a physical force. His muscles, accustomed to the rhythm of solitary survival, protested at this new pace. His mind, long enclosed in the familiar prison of grief, struggled to navigate the complex currents of human interaction after so much isolation. Yet beneath the discomfort, something else stirred. A sense of purpose, fragile but persistent. The feeling had been growing since he first found Kiona and Ayana in the snow, a seedling pushing through the frozen ground of his heart. "We stop soon," Nayeli said from behind him, her voice carrying easily in the clear mountain air. "Ayana needs rest." Mason nodded without turning. The little girl's wound was healing well, but she was still weak. He had been watching for a suitable campsite for the past mile somewhere, sheltered from the wind, defensible, if Blackwood and his men caught up sooner than expected. "There's a stand of pines ahead," he said, pointing to a dense cluster of trees about a quarter-mile up the trail. "Good windbreak, hidden from the path below." Nayeli made a sound of approval. They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mason found his mind returning to the moment of departure from his cabin. He had packed quickly food, ammunition, medical supplies, a few essential tools. As he was leaving, his gaze had fallen on the wooden figures lined up on the mantel. After a moment's hesitation, he had taken the owl, the last one he'd carved before the children arrived, and slipped it into his pocket. A talisman, a reminder of the life he was leaving behind, at least temporarily. A fragment of the fortress he had built around his pain. It rested there now, a small weight against his chest, as tangible as the rifle on his back or the knife at his belt. The pine grove, when they reached it, offered better shelter than Mason had hoped. The trees grew close together, their branches creating a natural roof that had kept much of the snow from reaching the ground beneath. A large boulder on the eastern edge would reflect heat from a fire while blocking the view from below. It was as safe as they could hope for under the circumstances. "We'll camp here," Mason announced, shrugging off his pack. "I'll gather wood." Nayeli nodded, helping Ayana settle on a fallen log, while Kiona immediately began clearing a space for a fire pit. The efficiency of their movements spoke of experience. This was not the first time they had made camp while fleeing from danger. The thought sent a surge of anger through Mason. Children shouldn't know how to flee, how to hide. They shouldn't have to. The world he had withdrawn from 5 years ago was still as cruel as he remembered. As he gathered deadfall from the perimeter of the grove, Mason kept his senses alert. The forest was quiet, too quiet perhaps. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It could be the natural hush of approaching evening, or it could be a warning. Predators silenced the forest as they passed through. Human predators, most of all. When he returned with an armful of wood, Nayeli was examining Ayana's wound. She had removed the bandage Mason had applied and was studying his handiwork with a critical eye. Her expression gave nothing away. "The infection is gone," she said without looking up. "Your medicine was good." Coming from a healer, it was high praise. Mason set down the wood, unsure how to respond. It had been a long time since anyone had commented on his medical skills, longer still since he had accepted such commentary without deflection or self-deprecation. "I had good supplies," he said finally, "and Kiona helped." At the mention of her name, Kiona glanced up from where she was arranging stones for the fire pit. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, pride perhaps. She quickly looked down again, but not before Mason caught the hint of a smile. "She has the gift," Nayeli said, rewrapping Ayana's shoulder with fresh cloth from her own pack. "The healing touch. Like me. Like you." Mason stiffened. "I'm not a healer anymore." Nayeli looked at him fully, now her dark eyes seeming to pierce through his carefully maintained facade. "The hands may stop their work," she said quietly, "but the heart does not forget its purpose." It was the second time she had expressed a similar sentiment, and Mason found it no less unsettling now than before. This woman saw too much, understood too much. He turned away, busying himself with building the fire. The familiar motions arranging the kindling, striking flint to steel, steadied him. Fire was simple, predictable. unlike the complex emotions stirring within him. Once the flames were leaping high, casting flickering light and welcome warmth through their small camp, Nayeli began preparing a simple meal from supplies in her pack and what Mason had brought. Dried meat, a handful of preserved berries, pine needle tea steeped in melted snow. It was meager fare, but after a day of hard travel, it tasted like a feast. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Ayana's occasional question, usually directed at Mason. The little girl had apparently decided he was worthy of her complete trust, a decision her mother observed with quiet attentiveness. "Why you live alone in mountain?" Ayana asked between bites, her curious eyes fixed on Mason's face. "No friends, no family." The question, innocent as it was, sent a pang through Mason's chest. Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of his raw grief, Kiona intervened. "Ayana," she said sharply in English, then continued in Apache, clearly scolding her sister for the personal nature of the question. Ayana's face fell and she looked down at her lap. "Sorry," she mumbled. "It's all right," Mason said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "It's a fair question." He took a deep breath, uncertain how much to share, but feeling somehow that these people who had their own deep wounds might understand his. "I had a family once, a wife Rebecca, a daughter Emma about your age." Ayana looked up, her eyes wide. "Where they go?" "They died," Mason said simply. "Sickness took them. Scarlet fever. 5 years ago." "And you could not save them," Nayeli said softly. It wasn't a question. Mason met her gaze across the fire. "No, I couldn't. I was a doctor and I couldn't save my own family." The admission hung in the air between them, as tangible as the smoke from the fire. It was the first time he had spoken the truth so plainly, without evasion or bitterness. Just the simple, devastating fact of his failure. "So you go to mountains," Ayana said, her small face solemn with understanding. "To be alone with sad." The child's simple articulation of his 5-year exile struck Mason with unexpected force. Yes, that was exactly what he had done. Gone to the mountains to be alone with his sadness, to build a fortress around it, where nothing and no one could touch it or him. "Yes," he acknowledged, "that's what I did." Nayeli was watching him with that penetrating gaze again, as if she could see not just his pain, but its roots, its shape, its weight. "The dead walk with us," she said. "They do not leave just because their bodies return to the earth. They remain, especially when our love for them is strong, when our grief keeps them close." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You said before, yeah, you can see them, the dead." Nayeli nodded slowly. "Not always, not all spirits, but those who remain because they are bound by love or by pain, yes, I see them." Her voice dropped lower. "Your wife stands behind you now. Her hand rests on your shoulder. She has been trying to reach you for a long time." Mason's breath caught in his throat. Every hair on his body seemed to stand on end. He resisted the urge to turn to look over his shoulder where Nayeli's gaze was focused. He didn't believe in ghosts and spirits. And yet, "And your daughter," Nayeli continued, her eyes shifting slightly, "she dances in the firelight. She is happy that you are not alone anymore." A sound escaped Mason, then something between a gasp and a sob. He closed his eyes tightly, unwilling to let the tears gathering there fall. It was too much, this woman's claims, the images her words conjured, the sudden visceral sense that Rebecca and Emma were indeed present. "Stop," he said hoarsely. "Please." When he opened his eyes again, Nayeli was still watching him, but her expression had softened. "I'm sorry," she said. "I forget sometimes that not everyone wants to see what I see." The moment was broken by Ayana's yawn, wide and unrestrained. The little girl was fighting to keep her eyes open, exhaustion from the day's journey finally catching up with her. Kiona immediately began preparing a sleeping place for her sister, spreading a blanket near the fire. The practiced domesticity of her actions, a child performing adult tasks without complaint, reminded Mason again of how much these sisters had endured. As Nayeli tucked Ayana in for the night, Mason moved to the edge of the camp, ostensibly to keep watch, but really to regain his composure. The conversation had left him shaken. Not just Nayeli's claims about seeing spirits, but the simple truth Ayana had spoken. You go to mountains to be alone with sad. 5 years of isolation, of carefully maintained grief, suddenly seemed less like a noble bearing of pain and more like a kind of hiding. A retreat not just from the world, but from life itself. The realization was uncomfortable, challenging the narrative he had constructed to justify his hermitage. He had told himself he was honoring Rebecca and Emma by his grief, by his withdrawal. But what if he had been doing the opposite? What if by enshrining his pain, he had been keeping not just himself, but them, trapped in that final moment of loss? The thought was too large, too threatening to the foundations of the life he had built. Mason pushed it away, focusing instead on the immediate concerns of their situation. Blackwood and his men, the journey ahead, the approaching night and the dangers it might bring. Practical matters, tangible threats. These he could face. He was still standing at the perimeter of the camp, staring out into the darkening forest, when he felt a presence beside him. Kiona had approached silently, her footfalls as light as a deer's on the forest floor. "Mother says I take first watch with you," she said here, her voice quiet but firm. "She sleep now, then take second watch." Mason nodded, accepting the arrangement without argument. The girl had proven herself more than capable over the past few days. "You should rest too," he said. "It's been a long day." Kiona shook her head. "Not tired." After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Want to talk?" This was unexpected. In the 3 days since he had found the sisters in the snow, Kiona had been sparing with her words, speaking only when necessary. That she now sought conversation was a significant shift. "All right," Mason said, curious. "What do you want to talk about?" Kiona seemed to gather her thoughts, her young face serious in the fading light. "You were doctor," she said finally. "In war." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded anyway. "Yes. During the Civil War, I was a field surgeon with the Union Army." "You see many men die." The bluntness of the question was typical of Kiona, but it still caught Mason off guard. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Too many." Kiona nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Mother says you carry ghosts. Not just wife and daughter. Others too." Mason tensed. This strange family with their talk of spirits and ghosts, it unsettled him deeply. Yet he couldn't deny the truth in Kiona's words. He did carry other ghosts. Men he couldn't save on blood-soaked battlefields. Comrades who died while he worked frantically to repair wounds that were beyond his skill to mend. "Your mother sees a lot," he said, neither confirming nor denying. "She has gift," Kiona said simply. "Sight beyond sight. Why men hunt us? They fear what they not understand." The conversation was veering into territory Mason wasn't comfortable exploring. He changed tack. "Tell me about Blackwood, the man hunting you." Kiona's expression darkened. "Bad man, brother worse. He tried to—" She hesitated, searching for words. "Hurt my mother. She defend herself. Use plants that can heal but also harm. He die. Blackwood say she witch put bounty on her. $500. It was essentially the same story Nayeli had told, but hearing it from Kiona gave it a different weight. The fear in her voice when she spoke of Blackwood, the protective anger when she mentioned her mother, these were the emotions of a child forced to grow up too quickly to understand dangers no child should have to face. "How many men are with him?" Mason asked, his mind already strategizing. $500 was a significant bounty, enough to attract not just Blackwood, but others hungry for easy money. 3, maybe 4, Kiona said. Men with guns. Dogs too, for tracking. Dogs would complicate their escape. Mason frowned, calculating distances, terrain, the likelihood of snow to cover their tracks. "How far to your grandmother's village?" 2 days, maybe 3, Kiona replied. "High in mountains, hidden place, Blackwood not find it easy." If they could reach the village ahead of their pursuers, they would have a chance. Native communities in the high mountains were often well defended, the terrain itself providing natural protection. But 2 or 3 days was a long time to be exposed, especially with an injured child slowing their pace. "We'll need to be careful," Mason said. "Move fast when we can. Cover our tracks." Kiona nodded solemnly. "Mother no ways. Medicine to hide scent from dogs. Plants that confuse trail." She glanced back at the sleeping forms of her mother and sister, then added in a lower voice, "Thank you for helping us." The simple gratitude caught Mason off guard. "I haven't done much," he said, uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. "You save Ayana," Kiona countered. "Give us shelter, now guide us. Much more than most would do." There was something in her tone, a worldly wisdom far beyond her years, that suggested she had experienced the worst of what people could be, that she knew firsthand how rare genuine help could be, especially from someone like him. A white man in a world where white men had not been kind to her people. It's the right thing to do, Mason said, the words feeling inadequate. Kiona seemed to consider this, then shrugged slightly. Right thing, often hardest thing. She gave him a look that was disconcertingly adult. Why you really help us? The question pierced through Mason's carefully maintained defenses. Why was he helping them? The easy answer, because it was right, was true but incomplete. There was more to it, something deeper and more personal. I think he began, then stopped, uncertain how to articulate the complex tangle of motivations that had led him to this moment. I think I needed to remember. Remember what it feels like to care about someone else's survival besides my own. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than Mason had intended. 5 years of isolation had atrophied his ability to dissemble, to couch his truths in socially acceptable evasions. The raw honesty of his words surprised even him. Kiona absorbed this with the gravity that seemed natural to her. Good reason, she said finally. Better than pity. The conversation lapsed into silence after that, both of them watching the darkness deepen around their small camp. The fire burned low, casting just enough light to illuminate the sleeping forms of Nayeli and Ayana. In the distance, an owl called its haunting cry, echoing through the trees. After a while, Mason noticed Kiona struggling to keep her eyes open. Despite her insistence that she wasn't tired, the day's journey had clearly taken its toll. Get some rest, he said gently. I can keep watch alone. Kiona started to protest, but a yawn betrayed her. Wake mother in few hours, she said, finally acquiescing. She take next watch. Mason nodded and Kiona moved back to the fire, settling beside her sister with practiced ease. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Alone with his thoughts, Mason found his mind returning to Nayeli's words about Rebecca and Emma. The idea that they were present watching over him was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He had spent 5 years carefully preserving his grief, building a monument to it in the form of his isolated existence. What would it mean to consider that they might want something different for him, that they might be trying, as Nayeli suggested, to reach him? He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden owl. In the faint firelight, its features were barely visible. The curved beak, the wide, watchful eyes, the spread wings poised as if for flight. He had carved it as a guardian, a protector. Another in the line of totems he created for a daughter who could no longer receive them. What if instead of protecting Emma in some abstract, symbolic way, he could protect these living children, Kiona, with her old soul and fierce protectiveness, Ayana with her trusting smile and innocent questions? What if that was a more fitting tribute to his own daughter's memory? The thought was still forming, still too new and fragile to fully embrace, when a sound caught his attention. A snap of a twig, too deliberate to be an animal, too far to be one of his sleeping companions. Mason froze, every sense suddenly alert. He scanned the darkness beyond their camp, hand moving slowly to the rifle at his side. For a long moment there was nothing but the ordinary sounds of the night forest, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Then he saw it, a flash of movement at the perimeter of his vision, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper blackness between trees. Someone was watching them. Mason raised his rifle with practiced smoothness, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. He didn't fire, not yet. The figure hadn't advanced, hadn't made any threatening moves. It simply stood there observing. Show yourself, Mason called, his voice low, but carrying in the still night air. Slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure moved forward into the faint reach of the firelight. It was a man, tall and lean, dressed in buckskin similar to Nayeli's. His hair was long and black, streaked with gray, his face deeply lined. An Apache older than Nayeli, with the same watchful intelligence in his dark eyes. I mean no harm, the man said in clear accented English. I come for Nayeli and the children. At the sound of her name, Nayeli stirred and sat up, instantly alert. When she saw the figure standing at the edge of the camp, she rose in a fluid motion and spoke rapidly in Apache. The man responded in kind, his posture relaxing slightly. Mason kept his rifle trained on the newcomer, unwilling to lower his guard until he understood the situation. Who is he? He asked Nayeli. My brother, she replied, moving to stand beside the man. Kime. He was tracking us to help guide us to my mother's village. Mason slowly lowered his rifle, though he didn't set it aside. Family or not, the sudden appearance of a stranger in the night warranted caution. He could have announced himself, he said, a note of accusation in his voice, not skulked around in the darkness. Kime's expression remained impassive. I needed to be sure who traveled with my sister and her daughters, he said. These are dangerous times. Trust must be earned. The words might have been directed at Mason, but they could just as easily have been a general observation. Either way, Mason understood the sentiment. In this harsh wilderness where a wrong judgment could mean death, caution was not just prudent, but necessary. Nayeli spoke again to her brother in Apache, gesturing toward Mason as she did. Kime's expression shifted slightly, his gaze becoming more evaluative as it rested on Mason. Whatever Nayeli was telling him, it seemed to be of significance. My sister says you saved her daughters, Kime said finally, that you tended Ayana's wound with a healer's hands, that you guide them now to safety, though it takes you from your own path. Mason shrugged uncomfortably. He wasn't accustomed to such direct acknowledgement of his actions. They needed help, he said simply. Kime studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with what he saw. Then we are in your debt, he said, the formal words at odds with the wariness still evident in his posture. And I apologize for my approach. Caution is a habit hard to break in these times. The subtle emphasis on these times spoke volumes about the experiences that had shaped Kime's caution. As an Apache in the late 1870s, he had likely seen his share of betrayals, of promises broken, of trust rewarded with violence. His suspicion was not personal, but historical, carved by decades of conflict between his people and men who looked like Mason. No apology needed, Mason said, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. I'd have done the same in your position. This simple acknowledgement seemed to ease some of the tension between them. Kime moved further into the camp, settling near the fire with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to wilderness living. Nayeli joined him, and they spoke quietly in Apache, catching up on whatever news had transpired since they last saw each other. Mason remained at his post, giving them privacy for their reunion while maintaining his watch. The night was still young, and while Kime's arrival was apparently benign, it had heightened Mason's awareness of their vulnerability. If Nayeli's brother had found them so easily, others might as well. After a while, Kiona woke immediately alert at the sound of a new voice. When she saw Kime, she broke into a rare smile and moved to embrace him. They spoke briefly in Apache, Kiona's voice, animated in a way Mason had not yet heard. Whatever their relationship, it was clearly one of deep affection and trust. Ayana remained asleep through it all, her small body curled beneath the blanket, the wooden horse still clutched in her hand. The trials of the past days, the gunshot wound, the flight through the blizzard, the long journey today had exhausted her young reserves. Mason was glad for it. Sleep was the best medicine for her, now allowing her body to heal her mind, to rest from the terrors she had experienced. Eventually, Kime approached Mason at the edge of the camp. My sister tells me you were a doctor, he said without preamble, during your war between states. Mason nodded, unsurprised that Nayeli had shared this information. Yes, a field surgeon with the Union Army. You have seen much death then. It was the second time tonight someone had made this observation, and it struck Mason as peculiar. Yes, he said cautiously, more than I care to remember. Kime nodded as if this confirmed something important. And yet you chose to heal, not to kill, even in war. That was my duty, Mason said, uncomfortable with the implied nobility in Kime's words. I did what I was trained to do. As did the men who fired the guns, Kime countered. They too were following their training, their orders. Yet you chose a different path. To preserve life, not take it. Mason had never considered it that way. In the chaos of war, with men dying by the dozens around him, he had never thought of his role as a choice so much as a necessity. Someone had to try to save those who could be saved. It happened to be the task he was suited for. Why do you ask about this? He said, deflecting from the uncomfortable philosophical territory. Kime's gaze was steady. Because I am trying to understand why a man who has seen so much death would choose to live alone, away from all human connection. And why such a man would then risk himself to help strangers. The question cut close to the bone. Mason had been asking himself the same thing in different words since he first found Kiona and Ayana in the snow. Why break 5 years of careful isolation for 2 Apache children? Why continue to help them when their mother appeared, when the immediate danger was past? Why not simply return to his cabin, to the life he had built, to the grief he had so carefully preserved? I don't know, he admitted finally. I just couldn't leave them to die. Kimi seemed to weigh this simple truth, testing its adequacy. Perhaps, he said after a moment, the healer in you has never truly been silenced, only waiting for the right moment to speak again. Before Mason could respond to this unsettling observation, a noise from the darkness beyond the camp caught both men's attention. A soft, deliberate sound, the crack of a branch underfoot, too heavy to be a small animal, too purposeful to be the wind. Both men tensed, their conversation forgotten. Mason raised his rifle again, scanning the trees beyond the firelight. Kimi had produced a knife from somewhere, its blade glinting dully in the firelight. "Wake Nayeli," Mason whispered, quietly. Kimi nodded and moved silently back toward the fire. Mason remained where he was, every sense straining into the darkness. The sound wasn't repeated, but his instincts told him they were not alone. Someone was watching them, just as Kim had done earlier. But this observer had not announced themselves, had not stepped into the light when challenged. Nayeli appeared at his side, alert and tense. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone in the trees," Mason murmured, "watching us." Nayeli's expression hardened. "Blackwood. Maybe, or someone who works for him." They stood in tense silence, waiting for another sign, another sound. Nothing came. The forest held its breath around them, the only movement the dance of shadows cast by their dying fire. After what seemed an eternity, Nayeli spoke again. "We should move, now, while it's still dark." Mason hesitated. Traveling at night in the mountains was dangerous under the best circumstances. With two children, one of them injured, it was doubly so. But staying put, if they had indeed been discovered, might be even more dangerous. "How far to your mother's village?" he asked. "A day's journey, maybe less if we push hard," Nayeli replied. "Kimi knows the fastest routes." Mason weighed their options, conscious of the precious minutes ticking by. If someone was watching them, Blackwood or one of his men, each moment they delayed gave their observer more time to summon reinforcements or plan an ambush. "We'll go," he decided. "Pack quickly, quietly. I'll keep watch." Nayeli nodded and moved back to the fire where Kim was already gathering their meager supplies. Kiona was awake, her small face serious as she helped her uncle, her movements efficient despite the hour. Ayana still slept, oblivious to the tension around her. Mason remained at his post, rifle ready, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The night had deepened, the moon casting silver light through breaks in the canopy above. In that ghostly illumination, every shadow seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on his vigilant eyes. But there was something there, he was certain of it. A presence just beyond the reach of his vision, watching, waiting. He was still searching the darkness when Nayeli touched his arm, indicating they were ready. Kimi had Ayana bundled in his arms, the little girl mercifully still asleep. Kiona stood beside her mother, a small pack on her back, her expression solemn but unafraid. They moved out silently, Kimi leading the way along a barely visible path that wound higher into the mountains. Mason took up the rear position, glancing back frequently, every sense alert for signs of pursuit. The night closed around them, the forest a maze of shadow and silver, hiding friend and foe alike. As they climbed, the path narrowed further, skirting steep drops and winding through dense stands of pine. The going was slow, each step carefully placed to avoid loose stones or patches of ice. The elevation made breathing difficult, the thin air burning in Mason's lungs. He had been away from his cabin for less than a day, yet it felt like weeks. The familiar rhythm of his solitary existence seemed like a distant memory, replaced by this urgent journey through the night, this responsibility for lives other than his own. Strange how quickly priorities could shift. How swiftly the concerns that had occupied him for 5 years, the maintenance of his isolation, the careful preservation of his grief, could be supplanted by more immediate needs. The safety of 2 children, the evasion of pursuers, the successful completion of a journey that was not his own, but had somehow become his purpose. They traveled for hours, stopping only when necessary to rest or to check their surroundings. Ayana woke eventually, confused by the night journey, but brave in her discomfort. She didn't complain, didn't cry, just clung to whoever was carrying her at the moment, usually Kemi or Mason, their greater strength, better able to bear her weight on the difficult terrain. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first pale hint of day, Kemi called a halt. They had reached a small plateau sheltered by overhanging rocks and dense brush. a natural fortress, defensible and hidden from casual observation. We rest here, he said, gently setting Ayana down on a bed of pine needles. A few hours only, then we continue. Mason nodded, too exhausted to argue even if he had wanted to. The night's journey had drained him physically and mentally. He found a spot against the boulder rifle still within easy reach and allowed himself to slide into a light doze. He dreamed of Rebecca. She was standing in their garden in Philadelphia, hanging laundry on a line just as she had been in his dream at the cabin. But this time the sheets didn't turn red with blood. This time she turned to look at him, her face as clear and beautiful as the day they met. Mason, she said, her voice carrying across the years, it's time to let go. He wanted to argue, to tell her he couldn't, that letting go meant losing her all over again. But the words wouldn't come. He could only watch as she smiled at him, a smile full of love and a gentle sadness. We're not lost, she said, as if reading his thoughts. We've been here all along, waiting for you to see us. The dream shifted, and suddenly Emma was there too, running between the billowing sheets, playing hide and seek. Her laughter, a sound he had feared forgotten, filled the air around him. "Daddy," she called. "Daddy, look." He turned, and there she was, holding out her small hands. In them was a wooden bird, intricately carved, its wings spread as if in flight. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Did you make it?" Emma shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, silly. You did, for Ayana." Before he could respond, could ask what she meant, the dream began to fade. The garden, the laundry line, Rebecca and Emma are all dissolving like mist in morning sunlight. "We love you." Rebecca's voice came to him, growing fainter. "We've never stopped loving you, but it's time for you to live again." Mason woke with a start, heart pounding, eyes wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. The dream had been so vivid, so real. Rebecca's voice still seemed to echo in his ears, her final words imprinted on his consciousness. "It's time for you to live again." He sat up, disoriented for a moment by his surroundings. Not his cabin, not the familiar confines of his solitude, but a rocky plateau high in the mountains, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the ground, and nearby the sleeping forms of his companions. Nayeli was awake, sitting cross-legged a few feet away, watching him with those penetrating eyes. "You spoke in your sleep," she said quietly. "To your wife." Mason wiped away the tears with the back of his hand, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "Just a dream," he said roughly. Nayeli tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Dreams are not just anything," she said. "They are messages from the spirit world, from our own deeper selves." "What did she tell you?" Mason hesitated, reluctant to share something so personal, so raw. But there was something in Nayeli's gaze, not just curiosity, but a deep understanding, a knowledge of loss and grief that matched his own. She said, "It's time to let go," he admitted finally. "Time to live again." Nayeli nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "The dead know what the living often forget," she said. "That life is for the living. That grief is a river to cross, not an ocean to drown in." The poetic wisdom of her words struck Mason deeply. A river to cross, not an ocean to drown in. For 5 years he had been drowning in his grief, letting it fill his lungs, his heart, his entire being. What if instead he could cross it, reach the other side, not by forgetting Rebecca and Emma, but by honoring them in a different way? The thought was still forming when Kim stirred, then sat up instantly, alert. "We should move," he said, glancing at the sky. "Cover more ground before midday heat." The practical concerns of their journey reasserted themselves, pushing Mason's philosophical musings aside. They ate a quick, cold breakfast, checked Ayana's wound still healing well, and prepared to continue their journey. As they were packing up, Kiona approached Mason, her expression unusually hesitant. "I find something," she said, holding out her small hand, "while you sleep." In her palm was a torn piece of fabric, a scrap of blue cloth frayed at the edges, stained with what might have been mud or blood. Mason took it, puzzled. "Where did you find this?" Kiona pointed to the edge of the plateau. "There, caught on bush, like someone passed recently." Mason examined the fabric more closely. It was cotton machine woven, the kind used in men's shirts. Not something that would have come from Nayeli or her family, who wore primarily buckskins and hand-woven cloth. A cold realization settled in his stomach. "Someone's been following our trail," he said, looking up at Kimmy and Nayeli. "Recently." Kami took the fabric, his expression grim. Blackwood's men, he said. They're closer than we thought. Nayeli's face tightened with worry. She gathered Ayana close as if the mere mention of their pursuers might manifest them from the surrounding forest. How far to your mother's village? Mason asked, his mind already calculating distances to rein the likelihood of evading pursuit. Half a day's journey, Kami replied. West if we push hard, but the path ahead is difficult. Narrow trails, steep climbs. Difficult for them, but also difficult for pursuers. That could work to their advantage. We go now, Mason said, hoisting his pack. No more stops until we reach safety. They set off at a grueling pace, Kim leading the way along trails that often seemed no more than game paths barely visible in the undergrowth. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, the air thinner as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ayana, still weak from her wound, and the night journey rode on Mason's back, her small arms wrapped trustingly around his neck. The weight was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. There was something oddly comforting about the child's presence, the warmth of her small body against his back, her occasional whispered observations about the scenery they passed. It had been so long since Mason had carried a child. The muscle memory of it, arms supporting legs, shoulders bearing weight, came back to him like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Kimi suddenly raised a hand signaling for silence. The group froze, every sense alert. For a long moment there was nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant cry of an eagle circling above. Then Mason heard a sound that sent ice through his veins. The baying of hounds, faint but unmistakable, echoing up from the valley below. Dogs, Kiona whispered, fear evident in her voice for the first time since Mason had met her. Blackwood's dogs. Nayeli's expression hardened. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew a handful of dried leaves, crushing them between her palms. Kemu, find water, she instructed. I need to prepare medicine to hide our scent. Kami nodded and disappeared into the brush, returning minutes later with his cupped hands full of water from a nearby stream. Nayeli mixed the crushed leaves with the water, creating a pungent paste. She applied it first to her own feet, then to Kiona's, instructing them to spread it on their footwear and the hems of their clothing. It will confuse the bum, she explained to Mason as she applied the mixture to Ayana's moccasins. Not for long, but perhaps long enough. Mason accepted the remaining paste, applying it as directed. The smell was strong and unpleasant, bitter herbs, and something else he couldn't identify. But if it would throw the dogs off their scent, he would have bathed in it willingly. We must split up, Kimi said, his voice low and urgent. I will create a false trail, lead them away from the village. You continue on the direct path. Nayeli shook her head fiercely. No, too dangerous. More dangerous if they follow us to Mother's doorstep, Kim countered. I know these mountains better than any dog or bounty hunter. I can lead them astray, then circle back to the village by another route. The logic was sound, but the risk was enormous. If Blackwood or his men caught Kami, there would be little mercy. Mason had seen enough of frontier justice to know how such encounters typically ended for Native Americans, especially those associated with someone accused of a crime. I'll go with him, Mason found himself saying. 2 trails will confuse them more than one. And I'm a better shot than I am a guide at this point. Kimi looked at him with surprise, then a grudging respect. It's a good plan, he acknowledged, but the children need protection too. I protect, Kiona said, stepping forward, her small chin lifted in determination. I shoot, I fight, Mother and I take Ayana to village. There was such fierce conviction in her young voice that no one immediately contradicted her. Mason looked at Nayeli, silently deferring to her judgment. These were her children, her family. The decision was ultimately hers. Nayeli studied each of them in turn, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. Kiona is right, she said. She and I can bring Ayana to safety. You two create the diversion. She fixed Mason with a penetrating gaze. You are sure about this? This is not your fight. Mason thought of the wooden figures on his mantle at home, the guardians he had carved too late to protect his own family. He thought of Ayana's trusting smile, of Kiona's fierce determination, of the baying hounds drawing ever closer. It became my fight when I found 2 children alone in a blizzard, he said quietly. When someone shot at them for no reason except fear and hatred. Something shifted in Nayeli's expression, a softening, a recognition. Then we trust your choice, she said. She reached out and touched his cheek briefly, her fingers cool against his skin. Be careful, healer. There is much life left in you yet. The simple gesture, the quiet words affected Mason more deeply than he could have anticipated. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such gentle concern, spoken to him with such sincere care for his welfare. They divided their supplies quickly, efficiently. Mason and Kami took the rifle and most of the ammunition. Nayeli kept her bow and a small knife. Food and water were distributed evenly. Then it was time to part ways. Ayana, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly broke away from her mother and ran to Mason. She threw her small arms around his legs, burying her face against him. You come back, she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Promise. Mason knelt down to her level, gently disentangling her arms so he could look into her face. I'll do my best, he said, not willing to make a promise he might not be able to keep. You be brave for your mother and sister, all right. Ayana nodded solemnly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden horse he had carved for her. You take, she said, pressing it into his hand. For luck. The simple gesture, a child offering her treasured possession as a talisman of protection, nearly undid Mason completely. He closed his fingers around the small carving, its smooth surfaces warm from being held close to Ayana's body. I'll bring it back to you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. That I do promise. Kiona approached next, her expression serious beyond her years. She didn't embrace him as her sister had, but she held out her hand formally as one adult to another. Be safe, she said simply. Kill Blackwood if you must. The matter-of-fact permission to take a life delivered by a child no more than 8 years old was a stark reminder of the world these sisters had been born into. A world where violence was not an abstraction, but a daily reality, where survival sometimes required terrible choices. Mason took her small hand in his, squeezing it gently. I'll do whatever is necessary to keep you all safe, he said. Kiona nodded, satisfied with this answer. She stepped back, positioning herself beside her mother, ready for the journey ahead. The parting was brief after that, a few final instructions from Kame about landmarks to watch for, a reminder from Nayeli about the herb paste and when to reapply it. Then they were separating two groups heading in different directions, one fleeing to safety, the other moving deliberately toward danger. As Mason followed Kame down a narrow trail that would eventually circle back toward the valley, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Nayeli stood on the ridge above Ayana in her arms, Kiona at her side. The morning sun haloed them in golden light, turning them into figures from a dream or a memory, something precious and fleeting. Then they were gone, disappeared into the forest, and Mason was left with the weight of his choice and the wooden horse in his pocket, a talisman of a promise he intended to keep. The forest floor was soft beneath Mason's boots, generations of fallen pine needles creating a natural carpet that muffled his footsteps. Beside him, Kame moved with the silent grace of a man born to these mountains, his moccasins leaving barely a trace of his passing. They had been traveling for nearly an hour, deliberately laying a false trail for Blackwood's hounds to follow. The baying of the mice had grown closer, then more distant, then closer again, as the wind shifted. It was impossible to gauge exactly how far behind their pursuers were, but the sound was unmistakable, the excited howling of animals on a scent. How much farther? Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kime paused, listening to the forest with the attention of a lifetime hunter. We've drawn them far enough from Nayeli's path, he said after a moment. Now we separate, create two trails instead of one. It was a sound strategy. If they split up, Blackwood would be forced to divide his forces or choose which trail to follow. Either way, it would buy Nayeli and the children more time to reach the safety of the village. I'll head west, Mason said, indicating the steeper slope to their right. Draw them up into the rocks where the dogs will lose the scent. Kime nodded, approving the plan. I go east toward the river. If they follow me, I can cross where they cannot. He fixed Mason with an intense gaze. Be careful, Doctor. These men do not take prisoners. The warning was unnecessary but appreciated. Mason had no illusions about the nature of frontier justice, especially when it involved a bounty. You too, he said. Meet back at your mother's village. If we both survive, Kime said, pragmatic to the end. If not, he shrugged slightly. The mountain will claim what it will. With that stoic acceptance of whatever fate might bring, Kim clasped Mason's shoulder briefly, A warrior's acknowledgement then disappeared into the undergrowth, heading east toward the distant sound of running water. Mason watched him go, struck by the strange turns his life had taken in the past few days. A week ago, he had been a recluse, a hermit by choice, isolated in his grief and determined to remain so. Now he was part of a desperate flight through the wilderness, risking his life for people who had been strangers just days before. The change should have terrified him. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. He checked his rifle one last time, ensuring it was loaded and ready, then turned west and began to climb. The slope was steep, the footing treacherous with loose rocks and patches of lingering snow. It would be difficult terrain for the dogs and even more so for the men following them. As he climbed, Mason kept his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The baying had faded somewhat, but he could still hear it echoing through the valleys below. The hounds hadn't lost the scent yet, despite Nayeli's herbal mixture. It was only a matter of time before they reached the point where he and Keem had separated. He needed to be well away by then, high enough into the rocks that the dogs would struggle to follow. His plan was simple: lead any pursuers on a difficult chase, then circle back to intercept the main trail that led to the village. If he was lucky, he would reach it before Blackwood's men, setting up an ambush to protect Nayeli and the children if necessary. The climb grew more challenging as he ascended. The trees thinned, giving way to scrub and then to bare rock. The air grew thinner, each breath burning in his lungs. 5 years in the mountains had made him stronger than most men his age, but this pace, this terrain, tested even his endurance. He paused on a narrow ledge, catching his breath and scanning the slopes below. The forest stretched out beneath him, a rolling sea of green, broken by outcroppings of granite. From this height, he could see for miles the path they had traveled, the valley where his cabin stood, the distant peaks still capped with snow, even in the summer heat. It was beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way. A beauty he had stopped seeing during his years of self-imposed exile, too wrapped in grief to notice the world around him. Movement caught his eye, a flash of color against the green near the point where he and Keem had separated. Mason crouched lower, squinting against the sunlight. There, 3 men following 2 dogs on leashes. Blackwood's men had to be. They had reached the fork in the trail and were examining the ground, determining which way to go. Mason held his breath, watching. If they split up following both trails, his plan would work perfectly. 1 or 2 men would be much easier to evade, or if necessary, confront, than the entire group. But luck wasn't with him. After a brief consultation, the men chose a single trail to follow. Even from this distance, Mason could see which direction they were heading. East, toward Kemi. A cold weight settled in Mason's stomach. Keem was capable, certainly a skilled hunter and warrior. But 3 armed men and 2 dogs were dangerous odds for anyone. Mason had hoped to draw at least some of the pursuers after himself to divide their forces and their attention. Now he faced a choice: continue with his plan, circling back to the village to provide protection there, or change course, heading east to assist Keem against what now appeared to be overwhelming odds. The sensible option was clear. His original plan was still sound. The children needed protection. If he diverted to help Kemi and they both fell, Nayeli and her daughters would be vulnerable. But as he watched the men disappear into the forest following Kemi's trail, with deadly purpose, Mason knew he couldn't leave the man to face them alone. Not when he had the high ground, the element of surprise. Not when he had promised to help. With a muttered curse at his own foolishness, Mason changed direction. Instead of continuing upward, he began to traverse the slope, moving east as quickly as the terrain would allow. If he maintained his elevation, he might be able to parallel Blackwood's men, keeping them in sight while staying hidden himself. It was a risky strategy. The open slopes offered less cover than the dense forest below. If anyone looked up at the wrong moment, they might spot him silhouetted against the sky. But it also gave him a crucial advantage: visibility. He could track his quarry without having to follow their exact path. For nearly an hour, Mason made his way across the mountainside, scrambling over rocks, skirting patches of loose scree that might give way under his weight. The men below maintained a steady pace, the dogs pulling eagerly at their leashes as they followed Kemi's scent. Then the forest opened up into a broad clearing, and Mason saw what Kemi had meant about the river. A swift, narrow stream cut through the landscape, its waters churning white over rocks. At this time of year, swollen with snowmelt from the peaks above, it would be a formidable crossing. But Kemi had known about it, had planned to use it. There had to be a way across that he was familiar with: a fallen log, a series of stepping stones, something that would allow him safe passage while presenting an obstacle to his pursuers. Mason scanned the river searching for any sign of Keem or such a crossing. There, about a quarter-mile downstream, a massive pine had fallen across the water, creating a natural bridge. Even from this distance, Mason could see the fresh disturbance in the moss that covered it. Someone had crossed recently. The men below had spotted it too. They were conferring at the edge of the clearing, gesturing toward the fallen tree. After a moment, they started forward again, the dogs straining at their leashes. Mason needed to move faster if he was going to intercept them before they crossed. He abandoned caution, half running, half sliding down the slope toward the river. Loose rocks clattered beneath his boots, announcing his approach to anyone listening. But the men were focused on their prey, and the sound of the rushing water covered most other noises. They didn't look up as Mason made his way down to the river parallel to their position, but still hidden by the trees. He reached the bank just as the first man was stepping onto the fallen log, testing its stability. The other two waited with Apache, scanning the far bank for any sign of their quarry. They were heavily armed, rifles, pistols, knives, and dressed for hard travel in the wilderness. Bounty hunters, experienced ones by the look of them. Mason raised his rifle, sighting along the barrel at the man on the log. It would be an easy shot. One man down, two to go. But something stayed his finger on the trigger. These men were doing a job, however unsavory. They weren't soldiers in a war, enemies on a battlefield. They were misguided, perhaps fueled by prejudice and greed, but that didn't make them legitimate targets for execution without warning. 5 years as a battlefield surgeon had given Mason a profound respect for human life, even the lives of those on the opposing side. He had patched up Confederate soldiers and alongside Union men, had never discriminated in his care. To kill in cold blood, even to protect Keem and the others, felt like a violation of the oath he had taken so many years ago. Instead, he shifted his aim and fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the log just in front of the lead man's feet. The effect was immediate. The man leaped back, nearly falling into the rushing water in his haste to retreat. All three drew their weapons, spinning in Mason's direction, trying to locate the shooter. "That's far enough," Mason called, keeping his position concealed among the trees. "The next shot won't miss." The men exchanged glances, clearly assessing their options. The one who had been on the log, a tall, lean man with a weather-beaten face, stepped forward slightly. "We're not looking for trouble, friend," he called back. "Just tracking a fugitive. There's a reward for his capture." "What's the charge?" Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. "Accessory to murder. He's traveling with a witch, an Apache woman who killed a white man with her spells. $500 for her, $200 for him." The man's voice took on a persuasive tone. "There's room for another gun in this hunt if you're interested. Split the bounty." It was a reasonable offer from their perspective. A lone hunter, apparently skilled enough to get the drop on them, would be a valuable addition to their party. Better to recruit him than fight him. "I'm not interested in blood money," Mason replied. "Turn around and go back the way you came. The people you're hunting are under my protection." This pronouncement was met with surprised silence, followed by a harsh laugh from one of the other men, a stockier figure with a beard that covered most of his face. "Your protection," he sneered. "Who the hell are you to protect murderers and witches?" "Just a man who knows the difference between justice and a lynching," Mason said, keeping his voice steady. "The woman you're hunting defended herself against assault. Her brother and children are innocent of any crime. There won't be any bounty collected today." The third man, who had been silent until now, suddenly stepped forward. He was shorter than the others, but carried himself with authority. His clothing was finer, his bearing more confident. Unlike his companions, he wore 2 pistols in cross-draw holsters, suggesting a man accustomed to quick violence. "You're making a mistake, mister," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "I'm Walter Blackwood. That witch killed my brother. This isn't about a bounty, it's about justice." So this was Blackwood himself, not just his hired men. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The man's eyes, even at this distance, held a fanatical gleam. This wasn't a simple bounty hunter. This was a man consumed by vengeance, by hatred. "Your brother attacked her," Mason said, keeping his rifle trained on the group. "She defended herself. That's not murder by any law." Blackwood's expression hardened. "She bewitched him, lured him with her heathen magic, then poisoned him when he discovered her true nature. She'll burn for it, her and anyone who stands with her." The casual threat, the absolute conviction in Blackwood's voice confirmed what Mason had suspected. This man wouldn't be turned away by warnings or appeals to justice. He was beyond reason, driven by a hatred that transcended logic. "I won't let you harm them," Mason said simply. "Turn back now while you still can." Blackwood smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "You're outnumbered, friend, 3-1, and those are poor odds for a man with just one rifle." "Two rifles," came a voice from across the river. All heads turned to see Kimi standing on the far bank, his own weapon aimed at the group. He must have doubled back when he realized he was being followed, setting up his own ambush from the opposite side. "And a bow," added another voice, this one from the trees to Mason's right. Nayeli stepped into view, an arrow knocked and drawn, her aim unwavering as it centered on Blackwood's chest. Her sudden appearance sent a jolt of alarm through Mason. She was supposed to be heading for the village with the children, not circling back into danger. As if reading his thoughts, Nayeli spoke again. "The children are safe. I left them with my mother and came back to ensure you both returned." Her gaze never left Blackwood as she spoke. "I knew he would come himself. His hatred burns too hot to delegate his vengeance." Blackwood's expression shifted from confident to wary as he assessed the new situation. His men looked to him for direction, hands tight on their weapons, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in a crossfire. "Lower your weapons," Mason instructed. "All of you. This ends now without bloodshed." For a tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the rush of the river and the low whining of the monk, sensing the danger in the air. Then Blackwood smiled again, the different smile this time, one that sent a chill down Mason's spine. "Indeed it does," he said almost pleasantly. Then without warning, he drew and fired in a single fluid motion. The bullet struck the tree beside Mason's head, sending splinters flying. Mason ducked instinctively, returning fire almost without conscious thought. His shot went wide as Blackwood dove for cover behind a boulder. The clearing erupted into chaos. The other two men scattered, seeking shelter and firing wildly at both Mason and Keem. The dogs, panicked by the gunfire, broke free of their restraints and bounded away into the forest, their howls adding to the cacophony. Mason rolled behind a thick pine trunk, the bark shuddering as bullets struck it. Across the river, he saw Keem do the same, disappearing from view. Nayeli had vanished as well, but a moment later an arrow whistled through the air, embedding itself in the ground inches from one of Blackwood's men. A warning shot deliberately placed. The firefight settled into a tense stalemate. Neither side had a clear advantage. Mason and his allies had the bounty hunters surrounded, but Blackwood and his men had better cover and more ammunition. It was only a matter of time before someone made a fatal mistake. "This is your last chance, Blackwood," Mason called out during a lull in the shooting. "Surrender now. No one has to die today." Blackwood's laugh floated across the clearing, cold and mirthless. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about taking prisoners. The witch dies today. Her brother dies. Her brats die. And now so do you." The naked hatred in the man's voice left no room for negotiation. This wasn't a bounty hunter seeking a reward. This was a zealot consumed by a vendetta that had become his sole reason for existence. Mason caught Kime's eye across the river, then Nayeli's in the trees to his right. A silent communication passed between them, an acknowledgement that words had failed, that conflict was now inevitable. The realization settled in Mason's chest like a stone. He had hoped to avoid this moment to find a peaceful resolution, but some hatreds ran too deep. Some wounds festered too long to be healed by reason or mercy. "When I give the signal," he said quietly, knowing his allies could hear him, "fire at their positions, not to kill but to keep them pinned down. I'm going to circle around behind them." It was a risky plan, but their options were limited. A prolonged standoff would only drain their ammunition and energy, giving Blackwood more time to formulate his own strategy. Kime nodded once, a warrior's acknowledgement. Nayeli hesitated, concern evident in her eyes, but then she too nodded. They would trust his judgment, his plan. Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself. It had been a long time since he had been in combat, since he had faced the possibility of taking a life rather than saving one. The irony wasn't lost on him, a healer preparing to kill. But sometimes to save some lives, others had to be risked. "Now," he shouted, and immediately Kime and Nayeli opened fire, their shots striking the rocks and trees where Blackwood and his men had taken cover. Under the covering fire, Mason darted from his position, moving swiftly through the trees, circling wide to come up behind the bounty hunters. The forest floor was soft beneath his feet, muffling his approach. The roar of the river and the continued gunfire covered any small sounds he couldn't avoid making. He moved with a predator's patience, placing each step carefully, keeping to the shadows. Years of hunting in these mountains had taught him how to move silently, how to become almost invisible against the backdrop of nature. The first of Blackwood's men, the bearded one, had taken position behind a fallen log about 30 yards from the river. He was so focused on firing at Keem across the water that he didn't hear Mason's approach until it was too late. Mason struck him from behind the butt of his rifle, connecting with the man's temple in a precise, calculated blow. The bounty hunter crumpled without a sound, unconscious but alive. Mason quickly secured his weapons, then moved on toward his next target. The taller man proved more alert. He sensed Mason's approach and spun around, pistol raised. Mason dove to the side as the gun discharged the bullet, whistling past his ear. Before the man could fire again, Mason was on him, grappling for control of the weapon. They struggled briefly, the bounty hunter's frontier strength nearly matching Mason's own. But 5 years of chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling survival from an unforgiving wilderness had hardened Mason in ways his opponent couldn't match. With a sharp twist, he wrested the gun free and delivered a knockout blow similar to the one that had felled the first man. 2 down, only Blackwood remained. Mason approached the boulder where he had last seen the bounty leader, moving with increased caution. Blackwood was clearly the most dangerous of the three, quicker, more skilled, driven by a hatred that gave him a fanatic's strength. But when Mason rounded the boulder, weapon ready, he found nothing. Blackwood was gone. A cold realization struck him. While he had been neutralizing the other 2 men, Blackwood had used the distraction to slip away. But where? Toward the river, back into the forest. A scream answered his question, high, feminine, filled with pain and fury. Nayeli. Mason sprinted toward the sound, heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the trees to find Blackwood standing over Nayeli, who lay on the ground, clutching her shoulder, where blood seeped between her fingers. Her bow lay broken beside her. Blackwood turned at Mason's approach, a cruel smile twisting his features. "Your witch friend isn't as powerful as she thinks," he said, gesturing with the knife in his hand, its blade dark with Nayeli's blood. "No magic to save her now." Mason raised his rifle, but Blackwood was already moving, lunging forward with the speed of a striking snake. The knife flashed in the dappled sunlight as it arced toward Mason's chest. Years of battlefield instinct took over. Mason stepped aside, letting the thrust pass him, then brought the stock of his rifle up in a swift, brutal arc. It connected with Blackwood's arm with a sickening crack. The knife fell from suddenly nerveless fingers as the bounty hunter howled in pain. But Blackwood wasn't finished. With his uninjured arm, he drew one of his pistols, aiming it at Mason's heart from point-blank range. Time seemed to slow. Mason saw the hammer cock back, saw Blackwood's finger tighten on the trigger. Then a blur of movement from the side, and Kimmy was there, tackling Blackwood with the full force of his body. The gun discharged, the bullet going wild as both men went down in a tangle of limbs. They rolled across the forest floor, locked in a desperate struggle. Mason moved to help, but Nayeli's voice stopped him. "Mason," she gasped, her face pale with pain and blood loss. "Help me!" He hesitated, torn between the 2 urgent needs. Kimmy was fighting for his life against a man consumed by hatred. Nayeli was bleeding, possibly severely wounded. The choice made itself. Mason was a healer first, a fighter second. He knelt beside Nayeli, quickly examining her wound. The knife had sliced deep into her shoulder, missing any vital organs, but severing an artery. Blood pulsed from the wound with each beat of her heart. "Hold still," he instructed, tearing a strip from his shirt to create a pressure bandage. His hands moved with the sure confidence of years of medical training, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought faltered. As he worked to stem the bleeding, the sounds of struggle continued behind him. Grunts of effort, the thud of fists against flesh, the crunch of bodies rolling over forest debris. Mason forced himself to focus on the task at hand, knowing that every second counted in stopping Nayeli's blood loss. The wound finally slowed its bleeding under his skilled ministrations. Mason secured the bandage tightly, then turned to see how Kimmy fared in his battle. The 2 men were still locked together, both bloodied now, neither willing to yield. But Blackwood had managed to free his remaining pistol from its holster and was trying to bring it to bear on Kimmy's head. Without conscious thought, Mason snatched up his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, startling birds from the treetops. Blackwood jerked once, then went still, the pistol falling from his hand. Kim rolled away, breathing heavily, his face spattered with his opponent's blood. For a long moment, no one moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath as if in shock at the sudden violence that had erupted within its peaceful confines. Then Nayeli spoke, her voice weak but steady. "It's over," she said. "Finally over." Mason moved to check Blackwood, though he already knew what he would find. The bullet had struck true, entering the man's temple and exiting the other side. Death had been instantaneous. A healer who had taken a life. The irony wasn't lost on Mason. After years of trying to save men on blood-soaked battlefields, after countless hours spent fighting against death's advance, he had become its instrument. Yet he felt no remorse. Blackwood had made his choice, had chosen hatred over reason, violence over peace. In the end, he had left no other option. Kimmy rose shakily to his feet, wincing at what appeared to be bruised or possibly broken ribs. "Thank you, brother," he said simply, the form of address and acknowledgement of the bond forged in battle. Mason nodded, accepting both the thanks and the implied kinship. Then he turned his attention back to Nayeli, who was attempting to sit up despite her injury. "Stay still," he admonished gently, supporting her back. "You've lost a lot of blood." "The children," she said, her eyes focused on something beyond the clearing. "They need to know we're safe." "I told them to wait at the village," Kimi said, moving to his sister's side. "They are safe with Mother." But Nayeli shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "You know Kiona better than that," she said. "She would never stay behind while her family was in danger." As if summoned by her mother's words, a small figure emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Kiona, her young face set in lines of determination, a small bow clutched in her hands. She took in the scene with one sweeping glance, her wounded mother, her battered Uncle Mason standing over Blackwood's body. "It's over," she asked, her voice small but steady. "It's over," Mason confirmed. "Your mother is hurt, but she'll be all right. Where is Ayana?" "With grandmother," Kiona said, moving swiftly to her mother's side. "I made her stay. She was scared." The practicality of the child, her acceptance of the violence before her, struck Mason anew. This was a girl who had seen too much, who had grown old before her time in a world that offered little protection to those of her heritage. Yet there was still a child beneath the warrior's facade. As she knelt beside her mother, tears finally broke through her composure. "Ina," she whispered, the Apache word for mother filled with relief and fear and love. Nayeli reached up with her uninjured arm, drawing her daughter close. "I'm all right, little one," she murmured. "Thanks to Mason, to all of you." The intimate family moment made Mason turn away, suddenly feeling like an intruder. He busied himself checking the other two bounty hunters, who were still unconscious but alive. Using strips torn from their own clothing, he bound their hands and feet. When they woke, they would be helpless until someone found them. Likely to other bounty hunters, or perhaps the law eventually. It was a mercy they probably didn't deserve, but Mason couldn't bring himself to execute unconscious men regardless of their association with Blackwood. They would face justice of a different kind, the harsh judgment of peers who would know they had been bested, the loss of reputation that was often more devastating than physical punishment in the frontier world. When he returned to Nayeli's side, Kimmy was helping her to her feet. Despite the blood loss and pain, she stood straight, her dignity intact. "We should go," she said. "Ayana will be worried." Mason nodded, slinging his rifle across his back. "Can you walk?" he asked Nayeli. "With help," she admitted, a rare concession from a woman of such strength. Mason moved to her uninjured side, supporting her with an arm around her waist. Kemi took the lead with Kiona, following close behind, her small bow still at the ready, watchful even in victory. They made their way slowly through the forest, following a path only Kemi and Nayeli seemed to recognize. The signs were subtle, a bent branch here, a specific pattern of stones there, invisible to untrained eyes but clear to those who had grown up reading the wilderness as others read books. As they walked, Mason found his thoughts turning to what would come next. The immediate danger was past. Blackwood was dead, his men neutralized. Nayeli and her family would be safe, at least for now. But what of him? Would he return to his cabin, to the solitude he had built around himself like a fortress? Would he resume the life of quiet desperation he had been living before two lost children appeared in the snowstorm? The thought held no appeal. That life which had seemed like a sanctuary only days ago now felt like a prison, a self-imposed exile from everything that made life worth living, connection, purpose, the simple joy of being needed. But what was the alternative? He had no place in Nayeli's world in the Apache community that would shelter her and her children. He was an outsider, a white man in a time and place where such distinctions carried the weight of history of conflict. Yet he couldn't imagine simply walking away, returning to his isolation as if nothing had changed. Because everything had changed. He had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. These thoughts occupied him as they traveled the forest, gradually thinning as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler, the vegetation sparser. They were approaching the high country where Nayeli's mother's village was located, a place of natural fortification, hidden from casual discovery. Not far now, Kime said, pointing to a ridge ahead. The village lies just beyond. Mason nodded, adjusting his support of Nayeli, who was leaning more heavily on him as the journey wore on. Her face was pale, her breathing labored, but she made no complaint. The strength of the woman continued to impress him, not just physical strength, but a deeper resilience, a refusal to yield to circumstance or suffering. As they crested the ridge, the village came into view. It was smaller than Mason had expected, perhaps a dozen structures nestled in a protected valley, smoke rising from cooking fires, the movement of people visible even at this distance. Not a permanent settlement, he realized, but a seasonal one, a place of refuge during the summer months when the high country was accessible. Their approach had been noted. Several figures detached themselves from the village and moved toward them, men with weapons ready, watchful, and wary. Mason tensed slightly, aware of how he must appear to them, a white man armed supporting their wounded kinswoman. But Kim called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the distance. Whatever he said caused the men to lower their weapons, though their caution remained evident in their posture. As they drew closer to the welcoming party, a small figure burst from behind the warriors and ran toward them, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. Ina Kiona. Ayana's voice was high and clear, filled with relief and joy. She launched herself at her sister first, nearly knocking Kiona over with the force of her embrace. Then she turned to her mother, stopping short when she saw Nayeli's bandaged shoulder and pale face. "You're hurt," she said, her voice dropping to a worried whisper. "Just a scratch, little one," Nayeli assured her, reaching out to stroke her younger daughter's hair. "Nothing that won't heal." Ayana's gaze shifted to Mason, her eyes widening as she took in his blood-spattered clothing and exhausted appearance. "You fought the bad men," she said, not a question, but a statement. Mason nodded, unsure how to explain the complex reality of what had happened in terms a child could understand. But Ayana needed no explanation. She moved to his side and slipped her small hand into his. "You kept your promise," she said simply. "You came back." The trust in her voice, the unquestioning acceptance, struck Mason with unexpected force. He had promised to return, yes, but he hadn't fully believed it himself when he made that vow. Yet here he was drawn back to these children, as if by some invisible force, some need deeper than conscious thought. The village warriors approached cautiously, their eyes fixed on Mason with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. One of them, an older man with a deeply lined face and hair streaked with gray, spoke to Kim in Apache, his tone questioning. Kim replied at length, gesturing toward Mason several times during his explanation. The older man listened intently, his expression giving nothing away. When Kim finished, the man turned to Mason, studying him with penetrating dark eyes. "My son says you killed the man who hunted my daughter," he said in surprisingly good English. "That you fought to protect her and my grandchildren." Mason nodded, uncomfortable with the direct acknowledgement of what he had done. "Blackwood left no choice," he said simply. The man continued to study him as if searching for something in Mason's face, his eyes, his very bearing. Whatever he sought, he seemed to find it because he nodded once decisively. "I am Nokosi," he said. "Nayeli and Kame's father, chief of this band." He gestured toward the village. "You are welcome among us, Mason Calloway. As one who has defended our blood, you are welcome at our fires." It was a formal invitation delivered with the gravity of a man accustomed to authority. Mason inclined his head in acknowledgement, recognizing the honor being extended to him. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your daughter needs medical attention. She's lost a lot of blood." Nokosi nodded and issued a series of commands in Apache. Immediately, two of the warriors moved to take Nayeli from Mason's support, handling her with gentle care despite their fierce appearance. Kame went with them, leaning more heavily on his spear than before, his own injuries finally taking their toll now that safety had been reached. As they began to move toward the village, Ayana tugged at Mason's hand. "Come," she said insistently. "Grandmother will make Ina better. She is great healer like Ina. Like you." Mason allowed himself to be led, too exhausted to resist the child's determination. The events of the past hours, the confrontation, the violence, the taking of a life, had drained him in ways he hadn't experienced since the war. He felt hollow, emptied of everything except a bone-deep weariness. The village, when they reached it, was a hive of ordered activity. Word of their arrival, of the confrontation with Blackwood, had clearly preceded them. Women were preparing medicines, heating water, readying a dwelling for the wounded. Men stood guard at the perimeter, watchful for any further threat. Ayana led Mason to a large structure at the center of the village, a lodge made of hides stretched over a wooden frame, smoke rising from a hole in its center. Inside, lit by the soft glow of a central fire, an elderly woman was already tending to Nayeli, her gnarled hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined the wound. This must be Nayeli's mother, Mason realized. The family resemblance was clear in the high cheekbones, the proud set of the jaw, though time had etched deep lines in the older woman's face, turned her hair white as snow. She looked up as Mason entered, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. Like her husband, she showed no surprise at the presence of a white man in their midst. "You bound the wound well," she said, her English as fluent as Nokosi's. "Stop the bleeding that would have taken her from us." It was a healer's assessment, professional and direct. Mason nodded, accepting the evaluation without false modesty. "The blade missed anything vital," he said, "but the blood loss is significant. She'll need rest fluids." The old woman's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "A doctor who speaks the truth instead of magic words to impress," she said, a note of approval in her voice. "Rare among your kind." Mason didn't respond to this gentle barb. He was too tired for verbal sparring, too drained by the day's events to defend the honor of his profession. Instead, he knelt beside Nayeli, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. It was weak but steady, a good sign. "Will Ina be all right?" Ayana asked, her small face solemn with worry. "Yes, little one," Mason assured her, the certainty in his voice more than professional confidence. Nayeli was strong both in body and spirit. She would not yield easily to injury or illness. She needs to rest now, to let her body heal. Satisfied with this assessment, Ayana turned her attention to Mason himself. With the unself-conscious directness of a child, she reached up to touch a cut on his cheek that he hadn't even realized was there. "You're hurt too," she said, her tone accusatory, as if he had been hiding this fact from her. Before Mason could respond, the old woman, Nayeli's mother, spoke. "Bring him water, Ayana, and the small pot of green salve from my basket. He has cared for others. Now we care for him." Ayana nodded seriously and scurried off to fetch the requested items. In her absence, the old woman fixed Mason with a penetrating gaze remarkably similar to Nayeli's. "My granddaughter says you live alone in the mountains," she said, "that you lost your family and chose solitude as your companion." Mason stiffened slightly. He had grown unaccustomed to such direct personal observations from strangers. "Yes," he acknowledged simply. The old woman nodded as if his terse response confirmed something important. "Grief is a heavy burden," she said, "heavier when carried alone." It was the same sentiment Nayeli had expressed, phrased differently, but carrying the same weight of understanding. These women saw too much, knew too much about the human heart and its hidden wounds. "I've managed," Mason said more defensively than he intended. The old woman's expression softened slightly. "Yes," she agreed, "you have survived, but now perhaps it is time to live again." The echo of Rebecca's words from his dream sent a jolt through Mason's weary body. It's time to live again. First his dead wife, now this Apache elder he had just met, both offering the same counsel, as if in conspiracy across the divide between life and death. Before he could formulate a response, Ayana returned, carefully carrying a bowl of water and a small clay pot. She set them down beside her grandmother, then watched attentively as the old woman dipped a clean cloth in the water and began to gently clean the cut on Mason's cheek. "I am Liluya," she said as she worked her touch gentle, despite the strength evident in her weathered hands. Nayeli has told me of your kindness to her daughters, of your skill as a healer, of the darkness you carry within you. Mason remained silent, uncomfortable with this intimate knowledge of his inner state. How much had Nayeli shared? How much had she perceived with that uncanny insight of hers? My daughter sees more than most, Liluye continued as if reading his thoughts. It is her gift and sometimes her burden. But what she sees truly. She applied a pungent green salve to the cut, her touch precise and economical. She saw in you a good man lost in grief, a healer who had forgotten his purpose. I didn't forget, Mason said quietly. I chose to set it aside. Liluye's expression was knowing, almost amused. Did you? Or did you simply hide from it as a child hides from thunder beneath a blanket? The thunder remains whether we cover our ears or not. The metaphor struck close to home. Had he been hiding all these years? From his calling, from human connection, from life itself? The thought was uncomfortable, challenging the narrative he had constructed to justify his exile. Before he could pursue this unsettling line of thought, Nayeli stirred on her pallet, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented for a moment, then focused on Mason with a clarity that belied her weakened state. You stayed, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stayed. Mason confirmed, moving to her side. How do you feel? Like I was stabbed. Nayeli said, a faint smile touching her lips, despite the pain evident in her eyes. But I will heal, thanks to you. Mason shook his head slightly. I only stopped the bleeding, he said. Your mother is the healer now. Nayeli's gaze shifted between Mason and Liluye, something unspoken passing between mother and daughter. Two healers, she murmured. Better than one. Liluye made a sound that might have been agreement or simply acknowledgement. She rose from Mason's side, her movements fluid despite her age, and moved to check Nayeli's bandage. You need rest, she told her daughter firmly. No more talking. Nayeli looked as if she might argue, but then Ayana crawled onto the pallet beside her, nestling close to her uninjured side. The simple comfort of her daughter's presence seemed to ease something in Nayeli, and she relaxed visibly. Rest, Mason echoed, rising to his feet. Doctor's orders. This earned him another faint smile from Nayeli, before her eyes drifted closed, her body surrendering to the healing embrace of sleep. Mason stepped outside the lodge, his body suddenly heavy with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. The events of the past days, the rescue of the children, the journey through the mountains, the confrontation with Blackwood had depleted not just his strength but his emotional reserves as well. The village was settling into evening routines. Cooking fires burned bright, their smoke rising straight in the still mountain air. Children played quietly under the watchful eyes of elders. Men cleaned weapons or repaired tools, their movements unhurried but purposeful. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that contrasted sharply with the violence of the day. Yet the two existed side by side in this harsh frontier world, peace and violence, healing and harm, life and death. The people of this village understood that duality, accepted it as part of the natural order. Perhaps that was why they had accepted him so readily, despite the color of his skin and all it represented. They recognized in him a similar understanding, a similar acceptance of life's harsh contrasts. Kiona found him sitting on a log at the edge of the village, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. She approached silently, her small feet making no sound on the packed earth, and settled beside him without speaking. For a long while they sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade from the day. The first stars appeared bright points against the deepening blue. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Will you go back? Kiona asked finally, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Mason didn't pretend to misunderstand. To my cabin, you mean? Kiona nodded, her profile solemn in the fading light. It was a question Mason had been asking himself since they reached the village. Would he return to his solitude, to the life he had built around his grief? Could he, after everything that had happened? I don't know, he admitted. It's been my home for 5 years. Kiona seemed to consider this. Home is not place, she said after a moment. Home is people, family. Out of the mouths of babes, Mason thought. Such simple wisdom, yet so profound. His cabin had been a shelter, yes, but had it truly been a home, or just a well-constructed prison, a place to serve his self-imposed sentence of isolation? What would you have me do? He asked, curious about this child's perspective. Kiona looked up at him, her dark eyes serious in the twilight. Stay, she said simply. Help Ina heal. Teach me medicine. Be part of our family. The directness of the invitation took Mason aback. It's not that simple, he began, but Kiona cut him off with a gesture that was startlingly adult. Why not? She demanded. You save us. We save you. Family. Put that way, it did seem simple. An exchange of salvation of protection, a mutual recognition of need and capability. Wasn't that in essence what family was? Not just blood, but choice. A deliberate binding together of lives for mutual benefit and care. But there were complications. Kiona couldn't understand: the cultural divide, the historical animosities, the practical difficulties of a white man living among Apache. Before Mason could find a way to express these concerns, a figure approached from the village. Nokosi, his bearing regal, even in the simple act of walking. My granddaughter speaks wisdom, he said, joining them on the log, though perhaps with a child's simplicity. Mason looked at the older man, searching for signs of disapproval or mockery. He found neither, only a calm assessment, a weighing of possibilities. Your people have suffered much at the hands of mine, Mason said quietly. I'm not sure my presence would be welcome long term. Nokosi nodded, acknowledging the truth of this observation. The past is heavy with blood and broken promises, he agreed, but the future is unwritten. Each generation must decide whether to carry old hatreds forward or set them down. He gestured toward the village where fires glowed warmly against the deepening night. My people have chosen to judge each man by his actions, not by the actions of those who share his skin. It was a generous philosophy, especially coming from a people who had so many legitimate grievances against white society. Mason felt humbled by the wisdom it represented, the capacity for discernment rather than blanket condemnation. I don't know if I belong here, he said honestly, or anywhere anymore. Nokosi's expression was contemplative. When a tree is uprooted by storm, he said, it does not immediately grow new roots. It lies where it has fallen, gathering strength. But in time, if the soil is good, if there is water and sunlight, new roots will form. The tree will live again in a new place. The metaphor was apt, perhaps too apt. Mason had been uprooted by the storm of loss, had lain dormant for 5 years, neither living fully nor truly dying. Was it possible that he had found fertile soil here among these people who had every reason to reject him, but had instead offered welcome? I need time, he said finally, to think, to decide. Nokosi nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. Time is a gift we can offer, he said. Stay with us while Nayeli heals. Learn our ways. Let us learn yours. Then decide. It was a reasonable proposal, a compromise between immediate commitment and immediate departure, a space to breathe, to consider, to feel his way forward into an uncertain future. Thank you, Mason said simply. I accept your hospitality. Kiona's face lit up with a rare, unguarded smile. She leaned slightly against Mason's arm, a small gesture of affection that spoke volumes about the trust that had grown between them. As darkness settled fully over the mountain, Mason found himself thinking of his dream of Rebecca, of her gentle insistence that it was time to live again. He thought of the wooden figures lined up on his mantle, at home guardians carved too late to protect his own family. He thought of Ayana's laughter, of Kiona's fierce determination, of Nayeli's penetrating insights into his wounded soul. Perhaps this was what Rebecca had been trying to tell him. That life continued, that love could be found again, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a new chapter, a different story. That the best way to honor those who had died was not to join them in a living death, but to carry their memory forward into a life fully lived. The wooden horse Ayana had given him still rested in his pocket. He took it out now, turning it in his hands, feeling the smooth contours shaped by his own knife. A talisman, she had called it, for luck, for protection. But it was more than that, he realized. It was a bridge between past and present, a physical representation of the continuity of life, of the possibility of renewal. He would stay for now, at least. Would help Nayeli heal, would teach Kiona what he knew of medicine, would give himself the gift of time to discover what might grow from the uprooted tree of his life. It wasn't a final decision, not yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, he was coming to understand, were their own kind of salvation. The days that followed took on a rhythm both foreign and strangely familiar to Mason. He rose with the sun, joining the men of the village in their morning rituals, checking the perimeter, tending to horses, preparing for the day's hunting or gathering. His medical skills were called upon regularly, not just for Nayeli's wound, but for the various injuries and ailments that afflicted any community. A child's broken arm, an elder's persistent cough, a young hunter's infected cut, and always there was Kiona watching his every move with intense focus, absorbing each technique, each explanation with a hunger for knowledge that reminded Mason of his own early days as a medical student. She had a natural aptitude, a healer's instinctive understanding of the body's systems and needs. Teaching her became one of Mason's greatest joys, a way of passing on knowledge that might otherwise die with him. Ayana, too, became a constant presence in his new life. Unlike her serious sister, Ayana approached the world with unfettered enthusiasm, finding wonder in the simplest things. She collected wooden animals from Mason, a deer, a bear, a fox, each carved in his spare moments as gifts for the child who had first broken through his armor of isolation. Nayeli's recovery progressed steadily under the combined care of Mason and Lilui. The two healers, one trained in Western medicine, the other in ancient tribal knowledge, found common ground in their shared commitment to easing suffering. They exchanged techniques, compared remedies, each learning from the other's tradition. And in the quiet evenings, sitting by the communal fire, Mason found himself drawn into the storytelling circle, first as an observer, then as a participant. He shared tales of his time as a battlefield surgeon, of the courage and resilience he had witnessed in men facing death. Later, haltingly at first, he began to speak of Rebecca and Emma, not just their deaths, which had dominated his thoughts for 5 years, but their lives. The joy they had brought him, the love they had shared. In the telling, something shifted within him. The pain didn't disappear. It would always be part of him, but it changed shape, became something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. A river to cross, not an ocean to drown in, as Nayeli had so wisely observed. 1 month after his arrival at the village, Mason sat on the same log where he had spoken with Kiona in Nokosi that first night. The summer was waning, the evenings growing cooler as autumn approached. Soon the tribe would move to lower elevations for the winter, to sheltered valleys where game was more plentiful and the snow less deep. He had a decision to make. Return to his cabin, to the life he had built around his grief, or continue on this new path with these people who had become, improbably but undeniably, a kind of family to him. A soft footstep alerted him to Nayeli's approach. Her wound had healed well, leaving only a faint scar as evidence of her encounter with Blackwood. She moved with her usual grace as she settled beside him on the log. "You're thinking of leaving," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Mason nodded. Nayeli's perceptiveness no longer surprised him. "I need to return to my cabin," he said, "at least to gather my things to decide what to do with the place." "And then, Keen," Nayeli pressed gently. Mason turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time in days. She was beautiful in the fading light, her dark eyes reflecting the first stars of evening, her hair loose around her shoulders. There was strength in her face, wisdom in her gaze, a quiet dignity in her bearing that spoke of a life lived with purpose despite hardship. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been thinking about what your father said about the uprooted tree finding new soil." Nayeli nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And have you found new soil?" It was a profound question, one that went to the heart of his month-long consideration. Had he found a place where he could root again, where he could grow into whatever the remainder of his life might hold? "I think so," he said slowly. "But I'm not sure if it's here specifically, with your people." He gestured toward the village. "I've been welcome, more welcome than I had any right to expect, but I'm still an outsider in many ways." "You are thinking of the future," Nayeli observed, "of practical matters." Mason nodded. "The tribe will move for winter. I have my cabin, my supplies there. And there's the larger question of where I belong long-term, what purpose my life might serve." Nayeli was quiet for a moment, her gaze on the darkening sky. When she spoke again, her voice held a note of decision, as if she had come to some internal resolution. "There is a small valley 3 days' journey from here," she said, "near where the tribe winters. It has good water, fertile soil, game in abundance. My father has spoken of establishing a more permanent settlement there, a place where our people might live in the old ways while still adapting to the changing world." Mason listened, uncertain where this was leading, but sensing its importance. Such a place would need a healer, Nayeli continued. Someone who understands both the old medicines and the new, someone who could teach others as you have taught Kiona. The implication was clear, and it sent a jolt of surprise through Mason. You're offering me a place, he said, a role. Nayeli nodded. My father has discussed it with the council. They have agreed. You would be welcome not as a visitor, but as part of our community. A healer, a teacher. She paused, then added more softly, a friend. The offer was unexpected, generous beyond anything Mason could have anticipated. To be invited not just to stay, but to become part of the community's future, to have a recognized role, a purpose. It was more than he had dared hope for. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say you will consider it, Nayeli suggested. Go to your cabin. Gather what is precious to you. Make your peace with that place and the memories it holds. Then return to us if that is your choice. It was a reasonable proposal, offering him the time and space to make a decision of such magnitude. Yet Mason sensed there was more to Nayeli's suggestion than practical considerations alone. And if I return, he asked, watching her face carefully. What then? Nayeli met his gaze steadily, something vulnerable yet determined in her eyes. Then we will see what grows from new soil, she said softly, together. The word hung in the air between them, filled with possibility. Together. Not just a place in the community, but a place at her side. The prospect both terrified and exhilarated him. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to contemplate such a connection, such a future. I need to think, he said finally, about all of it. Nayeli nodded, accepting his caution without offense. Of course, she said, rising from the log, but do not think too long, healer. Life is shorter than we imagine, and its gifts should not be refused out of fear. With that gentle admonition, she left him to his thoughts, her figure silhouetted against the village fires as she walked away. Mason remained on the log long after she had gone, watching the stars emerge in their full glory, bright and clear in the mountain air. The choice before him was momentous, not just a decision about where to live or what to do, but about who to be. About whether to embrace a future he had never imagined or return to a past he had thought inescapable. He reached into his pocket and withdrew two objects, the wooden owl he had carried from his cabin, the last guardian he had carved before finding Kiona and Ayana in the snow, and the wooden horse Ayana had given him as a talisman of protection. Old and new, past and future, loss and possibility. In the quiet of the mountain night, with the soft sounds of the village behind him and the vast wilderness before him, Mason Calloway made his choice, not out of desperation or fear or grief, but out of hope, out of the recognition that life, even after devastating loss, offered second chances, new beginnings, fresh soil for roots to grow. He would return to his cabin, yes, would gather what was precious, would make his peace with the memories that dwelled there. And then he would come back to this place, to these people who had shown him that the fortress of his grief was not a sanctuary, but a prison of his own making. To Kiona with her serious eyes and healer's hands. To Ayana with her joyful spirit and trusting heart. To Nayeli with her quiet strength and penetrating wisdom. To a future he could not fully envision, but was at last ready to embrace. As Mason rose to return to the village, a sense of peace settled over him. The silence that had been his constant companion for 5 years was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of isolation and grief, but the gentle quiet of acceptance, of healing, of hope. A silence not of emptiness, but of possibility. Not of ending, but of beginning. Echoes from a valley no longer silent, but filled with the promise of a life reclaimed.